Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Muse Fanfiction. In today's episode, we explore, what if Azula was reincarnated as Harry's twin sister and they conquered the wizarding world together? Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, Ash and beginning. She remembered dying. Not the dramatic kind, no battlefield, no last stand, no blue fire guttering out against a worthy opponent. She had died in a bed, in a cell with clean sheets and barred windows, in a place they called a healing facility but which she had always known was a prison. She had been old by then, or at least older than she'd ever expected to be, and her last thought had been something she'd spent decades refusing to feel, relief. Then nothing. Then a sensation like being compressed from every direction, like the universe folding her small and tight and impossibly warm, and then a sound she'd never heard before in her life but recognized in her bones, a heartbeat. Not hers. Beside hers. She woke up as a baby, and she remembered everything. That was the worst part, actually. Not the helplessness, though that was maddening in ways she lacked the vocabulary to express when vocabulary itself was new again. Not the confused, unfocused eyes, or the way her hands were fat and useless, or the way the hunger hit her body before she could think a counterargument. The worst part was that her mind was entirely, crystallinely, hers, every memory, every calculation, every scar, packed into a skull that hadn't grown enough to support the weight yet. She lay in a crib in a house that smelled like new wood and something floral she couldn't name, and she thought, where am I, and what is the strategic situation? The answers came in pieces. The man who came to feed her had a young face and black hair that wouldn't lie flat, and eyes the color of the ocean on a clear day, and the way he held her was so careful it almost undid her. She didn't have a word for the feeling yet, tenderness, she'd decide later, though in her first life she'd always said the word like it was something slightly embarrassing. He said her name once while she was being held against his shoulder, and the name surprised her so much she stopped crying. "Shoo, Lyra," he said. "Everything's all right." Lyra. Not Azula. Lyra Potter. The other baby in the room had her father's hair and her mother's eyes, and he watched her from his own crib with an expression of such profound infant seriousness that she felt an unexpected flicker of warmth. She studied him back just as seriously. "You," she thought at him. "Who are you to me?" He sneezed, and looked startled by it. She decided she liked him. The world resolved itself slowly, not because her mind was slow but because information had to be gathered carefully when your primary tool of observation was a baby's body. She learned the parents' names from hearing them called. Lily. James. She learned her own face from a mirror positioned above the changing table, dark hair like her father's, but her mother's pale complexion and wide eyes. The eyes themselves were amber, a particular burning gold that she would come to find familiar, and when she caught them in the mirror for the first time at about 4 months old, she thought, there I am. Not Lyra. Not yet. Azula, looking out. The magic announced itself the same way it must have always been there, through accidents, through moments of strong emotion. At 6 months old, she grabbed for a toy that had rolled out of reach and it slid 2 feet across the floor toward her hand. She stared at it for a long moment, turning this new data over carefully. Right, she thought. Different world. Different rules. In her first life, she had been born with fire bending that no one had to teach her, she had simply understood it, in her body, the way some people understand balance or rhythm. She had spent her childhood being told this made her a prodigy. Now that instinct reached outward and found nothing to bend, and the absence was disorienting in a way she refused to let herself grieve. Something else was here instead, something that lived in the air around her and responded to her want rather than her will. She spent the next few months experimenting methodically, with whatever fell within her reach. Harry, her brother had been named Harry, she'd established that much, watched her experiments with wide eyes and occasionally tried to participate. At 8 months old, he caught a falling lamp she'd accidentally toppled with magic and had not been fast enough to catch back. He didn't seem to understand what he'd done. He looked at his own hands with that same profound, slightly baffled expression, and she thought, yes, all right, both of us then. She was genuinely happy, those first months. She noticed this as a fact, the way she might notice weather, because happiness had been something she approached analytically even in her first life. But here it was, clean and uncomplicated, built entirely of, her parents were good people who loved her with the whole of themselves, her brother was funny and brave and sat beside her in a way that felt like having a wall at her back, and magic was real and it was hers. Then Halloween came. She knew something was wrong before the door opened. She had been awake, she was always awake when everyone else assumed she was sleeping, cataloging, processing, running scenarios she couldn't have explained to anyone because she didn't have real words yet, and she'd heard her father's voice change. Not the words, just the tone. She'd learned, in 2 lifetimes, to read the moment when a person realizes danger has arrived too late. She heard her mother cast something, heard the crack of spells, heard her father shout, and then the house itself seemed to flinch. She felt the presence before it entered the room. It came through the door like a cold front, like the air pressure dropping, and she recognized in it something she'd felt before, in her first life, in throne rooms, in the moments before the worst things happened. The particular taste of someone who had burned away every limiting thing about themselves and become purely, absolutely what they chose. She sat up in the crib. The figure that came through the door was tall and had a face that had forgotten how to be human, and he looked at her and Harry with the patient focus of someone completing a task. She met his eyes steadily, the way she'd been trained to meet the eyes of enemies, because she had found, in 40-odd years of her first life, that animals rarely struck what looked them in the eye without fear. He paused. Just a fraction of a second, a nearly imperceptible stutter in his movement, as though something surprised him. Then he raised his wand toward Harry. She wanted to do something. She wanted to, with every fiber of her rebuilt consciousness, but the body that contained her wanted to scream instead, and so it screamed, and so she screamed with it, and the green light hit Harry and, the world detonated. She woke up in the rubble. Something was embedded in her forehead above her right eye, and it burned, and she pressed her baby fist against it and felt the shape of it, a bolt, a jagged line, like lightning. She looked at Harry, who lay in his crib which had somehow remained upright, and his forehead above his left eye bore the mirror image. Interesting, she thought, through the screaming pain. Mirror twins. She reached across the space between their cribs, and Harry's small hand caught hers. They were still holding hands when Hagrid found them. The Dursleys' house was not the worst place she had ever been kept. She had the context for comparison. Ozai's prison cells had been worse, certainly. Several of her own assignments, over the years, had required sleeping in places that made number 4, Privet Drive look like a palace. She kept this context close and found it useful, because the Dursleys were unpleasant in a small, grinding, relentless way that was actually harder to endure than dramatic cruelty. Dramatic cruelty at least required something from you, gave you something to push against. The cupboard under the stairs was theirs for the first 4 years. One cot, technically, but she pulled Harry in beside her the first night and they had slept tucked together against the wall ever since, which reduced the cold and the dark significantly. Vernon snored like a collapsing structure. Petunia moved through the house like a woman trying to take up no space, which Azula found both pitiable and irritating, because the woman had clearly once known how to want things and had been trained out of it. Dudley was exactly what happened when fear and entitlement were given a child to inhabit. She was not cruel to Dudley. She understood him too well for contempt. She had been, in some sense, a version of him, the child who was taught that their needs were central and the world was an instrument to serve them. She simply did not allow him to be cruel to Harry, which she accomplished by the age of 4 through a combination of a look she had apparently retained from her previous life and, when necessary, small applications of magic that Dudley never managed to explain convincingly to his mother. She looked at me, he told Petunia once, standing in the kitchen doorway with a plate of biscuits he'd been trying to keep from them on the floor around him, crumbled and scattered by a small involuntary pulse of frustrated magic. She just looked at me and it fell. Petunia looked at her with barely concealed revulsion and said, "Clean that up." Lyra held her gaze and said nothing, and after a moment, Petunia looked away first. Harry found this endlessly entertaining. "How do you do that?" he asked later, in the dark of the cupboard. "You look at them until they feel it," she said, very quietly. They'd gotten good at the quiet. "Like they're a problem you haven't decided whether to bother solving." Harry considered this with his characteristic thoughtfulness, which she had come to love. He didn't dismiss things, he actually turned them over. "What if you do bother? Then they find out." He laughed his low, silent laugh that was just his shoulders shaking, and she pulled a fraction of warmth from whatever magic lived in her and let it settle around them both, and they slept. She had decided, very early, on a few principles. The first, she was going to let this world be what it was and respond to it rather than overlaying her old one on top of it. She had made maps of the wrong territory before and it had cost her everything. She would observe, collect information, revise her understanding, and act accordingly. The second, Harry was hers. Not in the possessive way she'd once thought of things as hers, people as assets, relationships as leverage, but in the way of I will not let the world do to him what it did to me. He was funny and kind and braver than he knew and he deserved a person who stood at his back without condition, and she intended to be that person. The third, she would not hide. In her first life she had been weaponized partly because she had been made to believe her power was the only valuable thing about her, and so she had worn it on the surface. Here, with the benefit of hindsight and a genuine second chance, she intended to be fully and unapologetically herself, because hiding was what her father had wanted of her when she failed to be useful, and she was done with that. She started reading when she was 5, which surprised Petunia, who had apparently been planning to keep them both behind academically, and who found that plan becoming increasingly difficult to explain when Lyra kept finishing Dudley's library books before he'd gotten to the second page. Petunia had, reluctantly, begun getting them books from the library, which was how Lyra discovered that the thing she was doing with warmth and magic had a name, wizardry, and that there was apparently a whole world of it, hidden inside this one. She sat very still in the library corner she had claimed and reread that page several times. Then she went and found Harry, who was in the garden, and she told him, and he sat up very straight with his crooked glasses and his too big shirt and he said, "You mean we're real? Like, actually? We are actually magical, yes," she confirmed. He absorbed this with a grin that cracked his whole face open, and then he pointed his hand at a garden snail and concentrated, and the snail rose about 4 inches off the ground before they both startled and it dropped, and they looked at each other with an identical expression that had nothing to do with shared genes and everything to do with shared life. "We're going to be extraordinary," she said. "You're already extraordinary," he told her, with complete sincerity and no agenda, and she had to look away, because she was still learning what to do with that. She read everything she could find. Not just about magic, about everything, because she had learned that breadth of knowledge was more useful than depth in any one direction, that the person who could make connections across disciplines would always outmaneuver the person who was merely excellent in a single field. She read history and chemistry and astronomy and mythology, and she filed everything in the ordered library of her mind and cross-referenced it constantly. She also, in the privacy of quiet afternoons, tried to reconstruct what she'd had. Firebending was gone, she was certain of it, the way you were certain of a missing tooth. But the instinct that had made her exceptional, the particular understanding of energy and force and redirection, that, she thought, might translate. She felt it sometimes in the edges of her magic, the way it wanted to respond not just to her wants but to her form, the angle of her hands, the direction of her attention. She practiced in the garden, very early, before the Dursleys woke. Small movements. Precise shapes. She was building something, though she didn't yet have the language for what. Harry practiced with her. He learned differently, instinctively, by feel, where she learned by principle, and they had found they were better together, each compensating for the other's method. When she was too rigid in her approach, he found the intuitive workaround. When he was too impulsive, she provided the theoretical scaffolding that kept the impulsion from exploding. "You think about everything too hard," he told her once, 7 years old, sitting in the garden with a cloud of leaves they'd been trying to organize hovering uncertainly above them. You don't think about anything hard enough, she replied. Fair, he agreed, and reached up and swirled his hand and the leaves swept into a rough spiral, which was impressive even if it wasn't organized. But look. She looked. She took what he'd done with instinct and added structure, and the spiral became a vortex, became a tight, neat column, and they both sat and looked at it for a moment. Yeah, Harry said. That's us. It was. The letters started on Harry's 11th birthday, which was also hers, same birthday, obviously, twins, and the particular chaos of the next week was something she managed with a level of patience she would not have possessed in her first life. She had, of course, known they were coming. She'd known about Hogwarts for 6 years. She'd been waiting with the particular quality of patience that is not really patience at all but rather the suspended energy of a person who has identified their moment and is simply waiting for it to arrive. When the first letter slid through the mail slot and Vernon Dursley caught it and went the color of a beet, she was reading at the kitchen table and did not look up. Ah, she said. What did you do? Petunia hissed at her, as Vernon crumpled the envelope. I didn't do anything, she said, which was technically true. I simply am something, which is rather different and which neither of you can prevent. You're not going, Vernon started. She looked up then, and Vernon Dursley, who was not a cowardly man exactly but was a man with a very well-developed instinct for self-preservation, stopped mid-sentence. She had not done anything threatening. She had simply looked at him in the way she looked at obstacles, and he had felt it. We will be going, she said, and went back to her book. Harry, who had been watching this exchange from the doorway with an expression caught between delight and alarm, sidled over to her once Vernon had retreated to the sitting room. You could have just asked, he said. Asking implies they have authority here, she said. They don't. Lyra. Harry. He sat down across from her and lowered his voice. We don't have to go through them we could be, you know. Nicer. She looked at him, and this was one of the things she had come to love most about him, that he said we, that it was instinctive for him, that he had never once in his life thought of her as someone separate from himself in matters that concerned them both. Nicer, she repeated. Fine. But if Vernon throws another letter in the fireplace, I'm retrieving it. With magic? With my hands, she said. And then with magic, if necessary. He considered this. That's actually more alarming. I know. They got their letters in the end, the letters kept coming with a dogged persistence she found professionally admirable, and the Dursleys eventually, in a state of what could only be described as haunted resignation, stopped fighting it. Petunia knew what Hogwarts was, Lyra had gathered that much. She had known what Lily was, and some combination of guilt and terror had folded her in on herself where it was concerned. Lyra had no particular feeling about this. The Dursleys were what they were. She hadn't needed them to be more, because she'd had Harry, and Harry had been enough. Hagrid came on a rainy night to a hut on a rock in the sea, and when the door came in she was already awake and sitting on the edge of the cot, which was a pallet on the floor in this version of events, and she watched the massive man fold himself through the doorway and hand Harry a birthday cake with a quality of attention she'd honed over decades. He was genuine. That was the first thing she noted. Large and warm and slightly chaotic and genuine, which was a quality she had not encountered in abundance in her first life and which she had learned to value almost unreasonably. He looked at Harry like he was something miraculous, which of course to Hagrid he was, and then he looked at her like he wasn't quite sure what to do with two of them. You must be Lyra, he said, settling onto the sagging couch and producing a kettle from somewhere about his person. Harry's twin sister, she confirmed. And also a witch. I assume my letter addresses the same points as his. Hagrid blinked. Yeah, near enough. Good. She picked up the letter, which she'd liberated from Harry's grip with a meaningful look that he understood immediately, and read it with the focused speed of someone who had been reading serious documents since she was 6. Gringotts, she said. Tell me about the goblin banking system. Lyra, Harry said, the way he always said her name when she was moving faster than he wanted, which was a signal she had learned to partially respect. "We should understand the financial infrastructure before we arrive," she told him. "It's basic operational preparation. It's also called tonight and Hagrid just got here." "I don't mind," Hagrid said, who had been watching this exchange with an expression of slight bewilderment. "I can tell ya about Gringotts. Though," he looked at her with a kind of careful curiosity, "how do you already know the name Gringotts?" She met his eyes pleasantly. "I read extensively. The night was excellent, actually." Hagrid was wonderful, there was no other word for him, and he told them about the wizarding world with the enthusiasm of someone who had never stopped marveling at it, and she asked questions and Harry asked different questions and Hagrid answered both patiently, and by the time dawn was graying the windows she had a thorough working knowledge of the political landscape, the social structures, and the key figures she would need to understand on arrival. Voldemort's survival she had inferred. The scars she and Harry both bore, mirror images, naturally, and the circumstances of their parents' death had told her enough. Someone had tried to kill them both that night and the curse had rebounded, which meant the killing curse had a specific counter-condition, and that condition was clearly not unique to Harry since she bore the same mark. She had filed this away and continued building her model. In the morning, on the boat back to the mainland, Harry leaned against her shoulder and said, "Are you excited?" She thought about this honestly, the way she tried to do for him. "Yes," she said. "What kind of excited?" She knew what he was asking, he could tell the difference between her various expressions of enthusiasm, had learned to read her the way she'd learned to read everything. "The good kind," she said. Not the old kind." She paused. "The kind that's about what we're going toward, not what we're leaving." He pressed his shoulder more firmly against hers, which was his version of a hug when they were in public. "Same," he said. Diagon Alley was an intelligence bonanza, and she treated it as such. She walked through it beside Harry and kept her face pleasantly neutral and her eyes moving, cataloguing the social dynamics of the shop interactions, the visible hierarchy in how people deferred to certain families, the architecture of the place which told you a great deal about its priorities. She noted which shops were prosperous, which were marginal. She noted the daily profit headlines at the newsstand. She noted the way the mention of their names, for Hagrid introduced them to almost everyone, produced reactions on a spectrum from delighted awe to barely concealed unease. They were the Potter twins. Apparently, that was significant. Gringotts was magnificent, she had not expected to be moved by a bank, but the scale of it, the depth and the dark and the carts hurtling through stone corridors, genuinely impressed her in the aesthetic way that had always coexisted with her practical mind. The vault was better stocked than she'd expected. She stood in the gold-light interior and thought about supply lines and operational capital and then made herself simply stand in the gold light for a moment and appreciate that they had resources. They were buying robes when she first encountered the Malfoy situation. She had separated from Harry briefly to examine a display of wand holsters, which she thought an intelligent investment, when she heard the voice, the particular clipped, performative confidence of someone who had been told since birth that their bloodline was a certificate of superiority. "Not Gryffindor, hopefully. Though I suppose if you're Potter," she turned slowly. The boy was blonde, pale, wearing clothes that cost more than most people's furniture, and standing with the kind of careful casualness that meant he'd rehearsed the position. He was looking at Harry with an expression that wanted to be condescension but was slightly undermined by the fact that he clearly had no idea what to do with the attention Harry gave things, which was full and direct and uncomplicated. "Lyra," Harry said, catching her eye over the blonde boy's shoulder. She walked over and stood beside Harry and looked at the blonde boy until he stopped talking, which he did fairly quickly. "Draco Malfoy," the boy said after a moment, recovering, and extended his hand in the manner of someone who had been taught that handshakes were a display of proper breeding. She looked at the hand. "Lyra Potter," she said, and took it. His grip adjusted, he'd been expecting something softer, she thought, and found instead that she shook hands like someone who'd spent a lifetime in throne rooms. She watched his expression recalibrate, very slightly. "You're both," he started. "Twins," she confirmed. "Yes. Is that surprising? No, he stopped. Tried again. I wasn't aware Harry Potter had a sister. Most people weren't, she said pleasantly. That's generally what happens when the press only covers one of you. He blinked. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, it was more like the involuntary response of someone who recognized a certain kind of wit and couldn't entirely suppress it. I was about to tell your brother, he said, recalibrating to include her in the conversation with the natural ease of someone socialized to manage groups, that some families are better than others in the wizarding world. Worth knowing before you arrive. Tell me, she said, which surprised him, because he'd expected either agreement or dismissal. Which families, and better in what sense? He opened his mouth and then paused, because the question was structured in a way that didn't let him answer lazily. She watched him work through it. Pureblood families, he said, slightly less certainly than he'd started. Families with tradition. History. Right, she said. And does that tend to correlate with current political power, or is it primarily a matter of social standing? He stared at her. I'm gathering information, she said. Not arguing. Well, not only arguing. Harry made a sound beside her that he converted quickly into a cough. Draco Malfoy looked between them, and then he laughed, briefly, genuine, quickly suppressed, and she thought, there it is. Something real, underneath. Current political power mostly, he said. The Ministry is full of old families. And Dumbledore? Half-blood. But he's, Draco paused. Special case. They usually are, she said, and meant it to cover several things at once, and by the slight shift in his expression she thought he caught at least two of them. They parted not exactly as friends, she didn't expect to acquire friends in a robe shop, but as people who had each filed something about the other under interesting problem, revisit. She could work with that. Ollivander's was last, and she had been anticipating this with a specific, focused interest. Wands were power made tangible in this world, she had gathered that much, and she wanted to understand what more actions write the next chapter now. Chapter 2, The Sorting of Storms. The entrance hall smelled like old stone and candle smoke and something beneath both that she couldn't name but which settled into her bones as significant, the smell of a place that had been doing important work for a very long time and knew it. Professor McGonagall met them at the doors. Lyra had been watching for the person who would come to collect them, because there was always a person who came to collect you, and in her experience that person told you a great deal about an institution's values in the first 30 seconds. McGonagall was tall and precise and moved with the economy of someone who did not waste motion on anything, and she looked at the assembled first years with the expression of a general surveying new recruits, not unkind, but absolutely unsentimental. Lyra approved immediately. She stood near the front of the group and watched McGonagall give her speech, the houses, the expectations, the sorting, and noted everything, the ghost who drifted through the wall on the left, the sound of several hundred voices beyond the great hall doors, the way certain students at the edges of the group were already angling to see Harry. The pointing started in about 10 seconds, which was actually better than she'd expected. Is that, the Potter twins, apparently, both of them, which one is? She did not look at the whispers. She was watching McGonagall, who was watching her back, she realized, specifically her, not Harry, with an expression that was professionally neutral but had a particular quality of attention behind it. Good, she thought. She's already noticed. The ghosts provided the entrance, dramatic and floating and very pleased with themselves, and the doors to the great hall opened, and she let herself take it in, the enchanted ceiling, the thousands of candles, the 4 long tables with their populations staring, the high table at the far end where the faculty sat. She walked steadily, neither hurrying nor hanging back, and let the great hall see her see it. The whispers followed them in like a wake. She had anticipated a lot about this moment, had run it in her mind many times over the past year, but the one thing she hadn't anticipated was the feeling of looking up at that enchanted ceiling, perfectly reflecting the clouded October-near night sky above, and feeling genuinely small in a way that had nothing to do with diminishment. It was the other kind of small, The kind that meant the world was much larger than you, which she had decided was a feature rather than a problem. Harry stepped close enough that their shoulders touched briefly, and she knew he was doing the same thing she was, absorbing the room, the scale of it, filing it all. The Sorting Hat sat on a stool at the front of the hall, looking ancient and slightly disreputable, and it opened its brim and sang. She listened to the song with real attention, because she had found that the things people chose to announce about themselves told you what they valued, and the things they tried to fit into rhythm and rhyme told you even more. The hat described each house in terms of its core quality, bravery, ambition, wisdom, loyalty, and she filed the descriptions with her existing knowledge and noted the gaps between what was said and what was likely. Gryffindor bravery, she thought. Slytherin ambition. As if the two are mutually exclusive. McGonagall unrolled her scroll and began calling names. She watched each sorting with the focused attention she'd have given a military briefing. The hat's process was quick for some, long for others, and she noted which students needed more deliberation and what qualities they seemed to carry. It was like watching a sorting algorithm run, and she found she could predict the outcomes with moderate accuracy before the hat spoke. She was wrong twice, which was useful data. Hannah Abbott, Lavender Brown, Terry Boot. The names washed past and the benches filled in pieces, and she stood with Harry and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting for much longer than an 11-year-old should have to wait for anything. Hermione's name was called, and she watched Hermione sit on the stool with the posture of someone trying extremely hard not to show that they were trying extremely hard, and the hat dropped to her eyes and paused, and then called Gryffindor, and Hermione's whole body exhaled. She caught Lyra's eye on the way to the Gryffindor table and they exchanged the briefest possible nod, acknowledgement and nothing sentimental, which was exactly the right register and which Hermione understood. Neville Longbottom went to Gryffindor after a pause that made him look like he'd received slightly bad news he was being polite about. Draco Malfoy was called, and he walked to the stool with the practiced ease of someone who had been told this moment was his due, and the hat settled on his head and said Slytherin before it had properly touched his ears. She noted the particular quality of his expression, relief structured to look like satisfaction, and stored it. Potter, Harry. The hall went very quiet. Not the polite quiet of attention but the active quiet of several hundred people simultaneously holding their breath, and Harry walked to the stool with his particular combination of reluctance and steadiness. He didn't like the attention but he wasn't afraid of it, and she watched the hat deliberate. Longer than average. The hat's brim creased twice, which she suspected meant it was having a conversation. Harry's eyes found hers from under the hat's brim and she gave him nothing, deliberately, because she knew he knew what she wanted him to do, and he didn't need her to broadcast it. Then, Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table erupted. She began walking toward the stool before McGonagall finished saying her name, which she caught from the scroll as she passed, and she sat down and looked at the hat on its stool and the hat looked at her with its ancient, clever, creased face, and she reached up and settled it onto her head. The voice came immediately, and it was different from what she'd expected. Not external, not truly internal either, but occupying some space between the two, like a thought that wasn't hers. Well, it said. This is unusual. Is it, she thought back, not a question. You are not simply what you appear. It was examining her the way she examined things, thoroughly, without apology. There is more here than 11 years. Much more. Yes. You know what you are. You know where you came from. A pause that felt less like hesitation and more like adjustment. I have sorted many students in 1,000 years. I have not sorted one who came to me already sorted. She sat with this. Then what's the question? The question, the hat said, and she could feel it moving through her, through the layers of who she'd been and who she was becoming, is whether you want what you chose last time, or whether you want something different. She thought of Ozai and his Fire Nation, of everything she'd built in service of a crown that hadn't wanted her for herself. She thought of Harry, downstairs at the Gryffindor table, who wanted her for herself and nothing else. Different, she said clearly. You could go far in Slytherin, the hat said, and she felt the truth of it, felt how easily she'd fit there, the politics and the ambition and the pure raw competence that Slytherin rewarded. Your ambition is considerable. Your strategic mind is, it paused again, and she had the impression she'd surprised it, exceptional. Genuinely exceptional, and I say that having sorted Albus Dumbledore. I know what I am, she said. Slytherin would be comfortable. I'm not interested in comfortable. Gryffindor, then. The hat's voice had shifted, something warmer, and something else she couldn't name. For courage. Though I suspect yours will look different from what that house usually produces. It will, she agreed. One thing, it said, just before it spoke aloud. The memories you carry, the fire you carried, they are yours. But this world has its own fire, Miss Potter. Don't spend this life fighting the last war. She stilled. I know, she said, and meant it in both directions. Gryffindor. The hat was off her head and she was walking to the Gryffindor table where Harry was making space beside him with the immediate natural ease of someone who'd been saving that space since the moment he sat down, and she settled in beside him and the Great Hall moved on to the next name and she thought about what the hat had said for exactly 30 seconds before she set it aside. The present required attention. She ate the feast, magnificent, genuinely, and she was not too dignified to acknowledge magnificent food, and listened to the conversations around her while appearing to focus only on the closest one. The older students had gathered around Harry with the particular energy of people who'd been told a legend was coming and were now calibrating the legend against the reality. She watched Harry handle it with characteristic grace, warm, slightly uncomfortable with the mythologizing, redirecting toward genuine exchange rather than performance. Percy Weasley introduced himself as prefect from one end, the Weasley twins introduced themselves as chaos incarnate from the other. She filed all of them with appreciation. Neville introduced himself to her with the careful politeness of someone who'd been told to mind his manners and took the instruction sincerely, and she liked him immediately for entirely different reasons than she liked most people, not for his capabilities, which were yet to be determined, but for the quality of his genuine nervousness, which suggested he was honest about what he was feeling rather than performing confidence he didn't have. What did the hat say to you? He asked, very quietly, while the twins were staging some kind of elaborate introduction down the table. She looked at him. It offered me options. Me too, he said, and then looked surprised he'd said it. I thought it was going to put me in Hufflepuff. It nearly did. I kind of asked it not to. Why not? She asked, genuinely curious. He thought about this with a seriousness she respected. Because I want to be brave, he said. I'm not brave yet. But I want to be. That's more honest than most people manage, she told him. He smiled at her with the uncertain smile of someone not used to being understood, and she thought, this one will surprise people, and filed him accordingly. After the feast, Dumbledore's announcements noted and catalogued, third-floor corridor prohibition particularly interesting, she followed the Gryffindor prefects up through the castle with Harry at her shoulder and used every minute of it. The castle moved. That was the first thing she verified, not metaphorically, not just the staircases that rotated, but the castle itself seemed to be aware, in the way very old and very powerful things sometimes were. She felt it in her magic, which had been extending its awareness since she stepped inside the doors, a low, constant hum of something that was not quite alive but not quite not. She reached out toward it, very gently, the way she'd once reached for air currents to redirect lightning. The castle noticed. She couldn't have said how she knew, just that the quality of the hum changed, briefly, became something that was almost attention. Interesting, she thought. Harry bumped into her from behind because she'd slowed without announcing it. What? He said, reading her face. The castle is paying attention, she said quietly. He went still for a moment, and she felt him reach outward in his own instinctive way, feeling rather than analyzing, and he said, yeah. Then, it's old. Very. Does it feel friendly to you? She considered. Neutral, she decided. Like someone who hasn't decided what we are yet. He nodded, processing this. We should be polite. She looked at him. To the castle. To the castle, he confirmed, entirely seriously. She thought about this. Then she put her hand briefly against the stone wall as she passed, which was either a greeting or completely absurd, and the hum under her fingers felt, for just a moment, warmer. "Fine," she said. The Gryffindor common room was chaotic and warm and entirely red and gold, and she stood in the middle of it and assessed the spatial arrangement, the exits, the acoustics, the way the fire threw light. Then she found the best chair in the room, a high-backed one near the fire with sightlines to both the portrait door and the stairs, and sat in it with the authority of someone who has designated a command post. Harry dropped onto the arm of the chair instead of the adjacent one, which made her move slightly to the right to give him space, which she did without comment because that was simply how they occupied furniture. "Day 1, he said. "Successful," she assessed. "Though we have a problem." "We have lots of problems," he said. "Which one?" "Quirrell." Harry turned to look at her with appropriate sharpness. "The defense teacher." "Did you notice, the turban?" he said. "Yeah." The stutter felt wrong. "It felt practiced," she said. "Real stutters have a rhythm. His doesn't, it starts and stops in places that are semantically convenient rather than neurologically consistent." He was quiet for a moment. "Could be other things. Anxiety, trauma, it could be," she agreed. "Which is why I said problem and not conclusion. I need more data." "How do you want to get it?" She looked at the fire. "His classes, first. Then proximity testing." "What's proximity testing?" "I'll know when I know." He accepted this, which was one of the more underrated qualities he possessed. He didn't need to understand every step before she'd completed the thought. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," she said, "we learn everything this place can teach us." He grinned. "That shouldn't take long." "For you, no," she agreed. "You'll have the practical mastered inside a month. The theoretical will take longer." "What about you?" She looked at him steadily. "I intend to be very thorough." Classes started the next morning, and she attended every single one with the focused attention of someone who was not a child arriving at school but a general surveying new terrain. Transfiguration was first, which meant McGonagall was first, and she had been looking forward to this encounter specifically. She sat in the second row, not the front, which announced itself too loudly, but close enough to observe the teaching closely, and watched the professor enter, transform from her cat form, and begin addressing them with the cool precision of someone who took her subject extremely seriously. "Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts," McGonagall said, with an energy that was somehow both a warning and an invitation. "Anyone who goofs around in my class will leave and not come back." Lyra appreciated this stance. She watched the matchstick-to-needle exercise and ran the theory before attempting the practical. The magic in this world operated on conceptual principles that she had been working to understand. It required both intention and knowledge of form, a clear mental model of what you wanted to become what, and then the specific gesture and word combination that apparently acted as a focusing mechanism. She had been working on the theory of wand work since she'd gotten her wand, and she had some ideas she hadn't had the chance to test. She held her matchstick. She felt the Thunderbird feather in her wand respond to her attention. She thought about the essential nature of the needle, not its appearance, but its function, its material, its fundamental metalness, and then thought about the gap between the matchstick's essential nature and the needle's, and she closed that gap. The matchstick became a needle. She examined it. Clean transformation, no residual wood texture, good length and taper. She put it down and moved on to the pocketbook she'd brought for this purpose, reconstructing the theoretical scaffolding while she waited for McGonagall to finish the circuit of the room. McGonagall's step slowed when she reached her desk, and she looked at the needle, and then she looked at Lyra. "Miss Potter," she said. "The key seemed to be material essence rather than visual approximation," Lyra said. "The matchstick and the needle share a proportional relationship and basic dimensional similarity, but the transformation is structural rather than cosmetic, so visualizing the form wasn't sufficient, I had to model the metal lattice." A brief silence. That is, McGonagall said, in a carefully controlled voice, a rather sophisticated approach for a first attempt. I've been reading ahead, Lyra said, which was technically true. Clearly. McGonagall looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an estimate they'd thought was generous. 5 points to Gryffindor. Across the room, Harry had produced a needle with a faint grain still visible along one edge, almost there, not quite complete, and was frowning at it in the particular way he frowned when he knew what he'd gotten wrong and was working out how to fix it. She watched him adjust his approach without prompting, and on his second attempt the grain was gone. McGonagall moved to Harry and gave him 3 points, and Harry caught her eye across the room and she tilted her head slightly and he tilted his slightly back, which was their version of good job. Charms was Flitwick, who was tiny and enthusiastic and technically excellent, and whose teaching method she appreciated because he explained the why of things alongside the how. She matched the swish and flick with precision on the third attempt. The first 2 were deliberate near misses designed to map the tolerance range of the motion, and when the feather lifted with a clean, controlled float rather than an erratic jump, Flitwick made a small sound of pleasure. Perfect control, he said. Remarkable. 5 points to Gryffindor. Ron Weasley, seated diagonally across, caught her eye with an expression that was trying to be annoyed about something and couldn't quite manage it. She understood, it was difficult to resent competence when it wasn't showy, and she had been careful not to be showy. She was simply precise. Potions was Snape, and Snape was a problem she identified within the first 4 minutes of his introductory speech. The voice was practiced, the dark, deliberate cadence of someone who had found an effective performance and repeated it until it became a kind of identity. The intelligence was real and considerable, and the knowledge base was obviously deep. But the particular way his attention moved over the room, settling on Harry with a quality of anticipation before the lesson had begun, told her several things she stored in her working model. He asked his rapid-fire questions with the specific cruelty of someone who wanted to publicly humiliate rather than genuinely assess. She recognized this pattern from her years in the Fire Nation court, the way certain advisors would question junior officers not to learn anything but to demonstrate the officer's smallness. She had once found this useful as a tactic. She now found it irritating. "Potter," he said, and he said it to Harry, but he was watching her from the corner of his eye, which told her he was uncertain which twin to engage. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Draught of living death," Lyra said, from across the aisle. The combination produces one of the most powerful sleeping potions known. The asphodel, a plant associated with death in several folkloric traditions, bonds with the wormwood soporific compounds at a molecular level to create something that operates on the magical and physical simultaneously. Snape looked at her. The expression on his face was not what she'd have expected, it was not the irritation she'd anticipated, but something more complicated. He had been planning to trap Harry, and she had stepped into the trap on behalf of her brother, and she had done it with information that was excessive for what he'd asked. She met his eyes without expression. 5 points from Gryffindor, he said, for speaking out of turn. "Of course," she said pleasantly. He stared at her for a moment, and she stared back, and something passed between them, not hostility exactly, but a mutual and thorough taking of measure, and then he moved on to the next question. Harry, beside her, did not say anything, but his foot pressed briefly against hers under the desk. She answered 2 more questions during the lesson when they were directed specifically at her, and she was right on both, and Snape deducted points on a technicality the second time and simply moved on the third. By the end of the lesson she had a thorough working understanding of Severus Snape's character and had made a provisional decision about how to handle him, which was essentially to treat him as what he was, a brilliant and damaged person whose damage occasionally overrode his brilliance, in whom she had no particular interest beyond what he could teach her, and who would learn in relatively short order that she was impervious to the particular brand of intimidation he had refined to a weapon. She had been intimidated by her father. After Ozai, no one was very frightening. The library became her territory within the first week. Not in the obvious way, she didn't claim a table visibly or drive others off, but in the systematic way, she knew the layout better than the other first years within 3 days, had mapped the restricted sections perimeter and points of access within 5, and had begun working through the upper year texts that the syllabus would eventually reach. She made notes in a system she developed herself, cross-referencing theory across subjects, looking for the connective tissue between transfiguration and charms and potions and defense that the curriculum treated as separate disciplines. She also made notes about the castle. It watched her in return. She'd started noticing it consistently, small things, unlikely things. The moving staircases arranged themselves more conveniently when she was running late, which had only happened once because she was not in the habit of running late, but the staircase's cooperation had been noticed. The gargoyle near the library that startled first years would move its head to watch her pass without its characteristic lunge, which she confirmed was unusual by observing it do the lunge to 7 other students in the same week. Twice, she had been looking for a specific book and it had been slightly, conspicuously, separated from the shelf, easier to see. She wasn't sure if this was the castle being helpful or the castle testing something. She proceeded on the assumption it could be both simultaneously. Quirrell's class came on Thursday, and she attended it with the specific, focused attention she'd been saving. He was teaching them about the dark arts they'd be learning to defend against, theory, in the first lesson, practical encounters in later ones, and he stuttered, and the stutter was wrong in the way she'd already established, and she sat in the 3rd row and watched him move through the room and felt her magic extend its awareness toward him. There was something. Not on him, not exactly, but around him, like a heat shimmer, except cold. She thought of what she'd read about possession and spiritual contamination, of the soul division theories she'd found in a restricted-looking book in the back corner of the library. She thought about the night her parents died, the presence that had entered the nursery, the cold quality of absolute, weaponized will. She stayed after class. "Miss Potter," Quirrell said, and the stutter was present but less aggressive when the room was empty, which was Data. "See, can I help you?" She looked at the turban. She looked at the space behind his eyes, which was doing something that genuine eyes did not do. She said, very conversationally, "Professor, I was hoping you could help me understand something. When the AK rebounds off a magical protection and the caster is destroyed, not killed, but destroyed, what happens to the remaining magical essence of the caster?" The room went very, very still. Quirrell's face did something she'd have needed to slow time to fully read, several things at once, on different layers. The stutter disappeared entirely for a fraction of a second. Something behind his eyes sharpened. "That's a rather advanced question," he said. "I'm a rather advanced student," she said pleasantly. "The texts suggest the essence may attempt to anchor itself to the nearest living host. Is that consistent with your understanding?" The silence stretched. "Where did you read that, Miss Potter?" The stutter was gone now, and his voice had a different quality, lower and smoother, and she thought, "There you are." "Library," she said simply. "Professor, you should know I'm very good at finding things." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, exactly long enough to be meaningful, and then she gathered her bag and walked to the door and through it, and she did not look back, because looking back implied uncertainty. She walked down the corridor until she was around a corner, and then she stopped and stood against the stone wall and let her pulse settle and thought through what she'd just done. It was possibly premature. It was definitely aggressive. She had revealed that she knew, or suspected, and she had given him, time to adjust to that knowledge. She thought about this and decided, good. She wanted it to know she was watching. She wanted the knowledge that someone in this school was not operating in ignorance. That changed the dynamic. Harry found her in their corner of the library an hour later, dropped into the chair across from hers, and said, without preamble, "You did something." "I always do something," she said. "Something that made you think very hard for an hour," he said. "Something about Quirrell." She looked up. "Tell me what you felt when he was near you." He thought about it seriously, the way he did. "Cold," he said. "Wrong cold. Like when something's been," he searched for the word. "Hollowed." "Good," she said quietly. "That's exactly right. What is he? I don't know the full shape of it yet, she said, which was honest. But I know what's using him. She paused. Our problem from the nursery. Harry went still. Then he nodded, once, and the quality of his stillness shifted into something she recognized, the particular steadiness he found when things became serious, which was not tense but simply grounded. What do we do? We watch, she said. We learn. We wait until we understand the situation fully and then we decide. She met his eyes. We don't act until we're ready. But we start getting ready now. Okay, he said. Then, does Dumbledore know? Almost certainly, she said. The question is what he's doing about it, and whether his plan is one we should participate in or circumvent. Harry absorbed this with the particular quality he had of holding difficult things. He didn't resist them or rush past them but simply made space. You don't trust him, he said. Not an accusation. An observation. I don't trust anyone's plan when it involves us as variables, she said. I trust him as a person somewhat. I trust his intentions somewhat. His methods, she paused, remain to be evaluated. That's very generous of you. It's accurate of me, she said. Generous would be assuming the best. I'm assuming nothing. He looked at her steadily, and then he smiled, not the full grin but the smaller, warmer version that she'd come to understand was specifically for her. Okay, he said again. We get ready. We get ready, she agreed. She went back to her notes, and he pulled out his own book. They worked in parallel, the way they always had, occupying the same space differently, and outside the library windows the October sky was darkening toward evening, and Hogwarts hummed around them with its ancient, attending patience. 3 weeks in, she had established several things. The academic hierarchy was clear. She and Hermione were the top of their year, with significant overlap but different strengths, Hermione's breadth and precision, her own capacity for cross-disciplinary synthesis. Hermione knew more pure facts, she understood more about what facts meant relative to each other. They had settled into a working relationship that was not quite friendship but was something she valued more than friendship in some ways, genuine intellectual partnership, neither of them performing for the other. Harry had settled where she'd expected, high practical aptitude, theoretically solid when he bothered, instincts that were frankly alarming in their accuracy, and a frustrating tendency to care very much about other people's problems in the middle of lessons. He had befriended half the Gryffindor common room inside a week through the simple mechanism of being genuinely interested in everyone he met, which was a social skill she respected philosophically and would never personally practice. Ron Weasley had surprised her. She'd provisionally assessed him as peripheral, but he had a mind for strategy that surfaced in unexpected places. She'd watched him play chess and substantially revised her estimate. He thought in positions and possibilities in a way that was neither Hermione's pattern matching nor Harry's intuition but something distinct and useful, and she'd begun asking his opinions on tactical questions with an oblique framing that let him think he was being consulted rather than assessed. This was, she acknowledged to herself in private, slightly manipulative. She was working on it. She was working on several things. The version of herself from her first life had treated every relationship as a tactical asset, and she was trying to do something different here, to want people's company because of the people, not the utility. It was harder to unlearn than she'd expected. But Harry helped, because with Harry it was effortless, and she used the effortlessness as a template. The flying lesson came on a Thursday, gray sky and cold grass, and she stood beside her broom and had a brief internal conversation about the fact that she had never flown on a broom and would be expected to have never flown on anything, while her actual baseline was several years of training in a world where the vehicles were rather different. She let the broom rise to her hand on the command and felt the magic in it, older magic than her wand, more ambient, the kind that lived in enchanted objects rather than running through them, and when Madame Hooch said mount your broom she did so and felt immediately and without question that this was going to be extremely easy. The broom wanted to go. She wanted to go. They agreed. She lifted off the ground, steady, no wobble, and brought herself to about 8 feet while around her the other students achieved varying degrees of liftoff success. Harry rose beside her with the expression of someone who had come home, and she thought, yes, of course he's going to be extraordinary at this. Miss Potter, Madam Hooch called up, with an expression she couldn't fully read from this height. You seem very comfortable up there. It's intuitive, she called back, which was honest. Stay at this height until, Neville shot upward. She tracked his trajectory immediately, rising, out of control, his grip too tight on the wrong part of the handle, and she had half moved to follow when Neville's hand slipped and he was falling and Harry was already going, because of course Harry was already going. She let Harry handle the interception and watched the angles, Neville's fall rate, Harry's approach speed, the wind, and stayed aloft and ready if the geometry didn't work. It worked. Harry caught the Remembrall one-handed, 20 feet off the ground, with the casual mastery of someone discovering they were born to something. She watched him realize it, watched the delight break over his face despite the circumstances, and she felt something warm and uncomplicated. That's my brother. McGonagall appeared from the castle with an expression of someone trying to suppress something. By the end of it, Harry was on the Quidditch team, youngest seeker in a century, which she noted would be important for several reasons, and she was riding back to the school with the settled satisfaction of someone who had watched a plan execute correctly without requiring her intervention. Wood actually cried a little, Harry said, falling into step beside her. Oliver Wood has been waiting 3 years for a decent seeker, she said. That's a lot of suppressed hope releasing at once. Do you want to play? She considered it. Not this year, she said. I have other things that require my attention. Next year, perhaps. She paused. Chaser. I think I'd be good at Chaser. You'd be terrifying at Chaser, he said. Yes, she agreed. They walked back toward the castle and Malfoy passed them with his 2 constants, Crabbe and Goyle, who she had assessed and filed under, large, blunt instruments, require a handler, and he looked at Harry with a quality of competitive irritation that she recognized as the beginning of something manageable. Well done, Potter, he said, which was both sarcastic and grudgingly real. Interesting that they let a girl ride, though, she looked at him. Draco, she said, as though answering a question he'd asked. Your father's generation thought women had limited utility in most areas. How's that perspective working out for Lucius these days? His jaw tightened. The 2 constants looked uncertain. Then, unexpectedly, Draco's eyes moved away and the topic was abandoned, and they walked past with the particular quality of an exit that has decided a conversation wasn't worth having, not retreating, just discontinuing. Harry waited until they were out of earshot. How do you always know exactly what to say? I know what people are afraid of, she said. I try to only use it defensively. Try, he noted. I'm improving, she said. October moved with the particular urgency of a school term that was building toward things. She could feel it, the way she'd always been able to feel the approach of significant events, not prescience but the habit of reading patterns. The castle hummed with it. The teachers were building toward something in their curricula with a connected pace that suggested coordination. Quirrell was a knot in the pattern, a place where the normal flow was wrong. She was in the library, 3 weeks before Halloween, when Hermione sat across from her with the specific quality of someone who had worked up to something. Can I ask you something? Hermione said. You're already asking, Lyra said, not looking up. Hermione powered through this with admirable determination. How do you know things you shouldn't know yet? Lyra looked up. Give me an example. Yesterday in Charms, when Flitwick was explaining the theory of charm maintenance, you asked about the secondary resonance effect before he'd mentioned it existed. I read ahead, Lyra said. There is no ahead, Hermione said. I've read every Charms textbook in this library up to Newt level and the secondary resonance effect isn't in any of them. It's in Flitwick's own published papers, which aren't in the general collection. A silence. You read Flitwick's papers, Lyra said. I read everything, Hermione said. And I don't know everything you know. That's unusual. A pause. I don't find it threatening, she clarified, with the precision of someone who understood how her inquiry might be read. I find it interesting. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what to say and decided on something true, though incomplete. I've been studying independently for years, she said. Some of my sources are non-standard. What kind of non-standard? Old. Not all catalogued. The kind of texts you find when you know what to look for and are willing to look in places people don't usually look. She paused. I'll tell you about them when I know you better. Hermione considered this with the focused concentration she gave all data. That's a reasonable boundary, she said. Thank you for being honest about it rather than dismissing the question. You asked well, Lyra said. You deserved an honest answer. Hermione nodded, satisfied in the way she was satisfied by solutions, and opened her own book. They worked in parallel for an hour in a silence that had shifted slightly, imperceptibly, into something warmer. Harry came in at 6:30, trailing Ron, and they dropped into the remaining chairs with the comfortable disregard for Lyra's workspace that she allowed from very few people and allowed from Harry universally. Tell them what you found, Harry said to her. She looked up. About what? The third-floor corridor. Ron looked immediately interested in a way that told her she'd been right about his risk appetite, which was considerable under the careful eldest sibling performance. You found something? The prohibition isn't about structural danger, she said, setting her notes down. The phrasing, Dumbledore's phrasing, was very specific. He said we shouldn't go there unless we wanted a painful death. He didn't say the corridor was dangerous. He said unless we want. That's not warning language. That's test language. Silence around the table. He's testing us, Hermione said slowly. Putting the restriction in language that challenges people like us, Harry said, which was accurate. Possibly, Lyra said. Or the phrasing was incidental. But either way there's something on the third floor he wants contained, and we need to understand what it is and whether it connects to our other problem. Quirrell, Harry said, for Ron and Hermione's benefit. Ron looked between them. What about Quirrell? She assessed for a moment and made a decision. There is something sharing Quirrell's body that should not exist, she said, and it has an interest in whatever is on the third floor. We need information about both before we can determine the right action. The silence around the table was different now, the particular quality of a group that has just been invited into something real. You're sure? Ron said. I am, she said. Harry? Something's wrong with him, Harry said. Yeah. Okay, Ron said, with the grounded steadiness that she now recognized as his genuine register under the easier surface. So what do we do? We prepare, she said. We learn everything the curriculum can teach us, we learn as much beyond the curriculum as we can access, and we wait until the moment is ours rather than someone else's to determine. She looked at each of them. And in the meantime, we don't go near the third floor and we don't give Quirrell or anyone else reason to look at us as variables they need to manage. You mean we act normal, Hermione said. I mean we act like children, she said, which was slightly different, and all three of them understood the distinction. Harry met her eyes across the table and in his face was the same thing she felt in her own chest, that particular combination of recognition and trust that was not naive but chosen, not blind but clear-eyed, and that was the foundation on which everything else was being built. Outside the library windows, the sky had gone full dark, and the enchanted ceiling of the great hall somewhere above them would be showing stars, and Hogwarts held them all in its stone arms and attended, and she thought, this is a good beginning. It was. And it was only that, a beginning. Chapter 3, Fire in the Forbidden Corridor. Halloween came with the smell of pumpkin and magic so thick it sat on the tongue, and the great hall outdid itself, 1,000 floating jack-o'-lanterns, vast quantities of food, the particular festive energy of several hundred children who had been working hard for 2 months and were enjoying the release of a celebration. She sat at the Gryffindor table and ate and watched and let herself enjoy it, which she was getting better at. The troll had been in the dungeons for 6 minutes before Quirrell ran in screaming. She knew it was staged the moment he entered, because genuine terror has a quality that performed terror doesn't. The body is slower, less coordinated, the breath comes wrong. Quirrell's feint was a half-second too deliberate. He went down like someone who had decided to go down, not like someone whose legs had stopped working. She was already calculating even as the hall erupted. The troll hadn't come in on its own. Trolls were not known for navigating castle architecture. Someone had guided it in, or opened something to let it pass, which meant someone had advanced knowledge of its presence, which meant the troll was a distraction. She ran the geometry. If you wanted the great hall cleared and the faculty occupied, you'd need something catastrophic enough to split attention multiple ways. Hermione, Harry said, suddenly, cutting through her thought. She refocused. What about her? She doesn't know. She's been in the bathroom. There was that thing earlier. He was already standing, and she was already standing, because she processed the problem in the moment he'd said it, and they were moving before the thought finished. Which bathroom? She said, pulling Ron up by the collar as she passed him, which startled him enough that he came along. Second floor, East Wing, Harry said. She was upset about what Ron said in Charms. She went, at a good pace, she said, because the faculty was herding students upward and they were going against the current, ducking behind a tapestry she'd mapped in week 2, taking the servant stair that cut diagonally through the East Wing and saved them 4 minutes. Ron was keeping up, she noted. He'd recovered from the collar grab with impressive speed and was running with the focused intensity she recognized from chess. Good. The bathroom was on the second floor east, and they heard the troll before they smelled it, a rhythmic crashing, wet and heavy, the sound of something enormous hitting stone without any particular strategy beyond hitting. She opened the bathroom door. The troll was approximately 12 feet of muscle and smell and genuinely terrible decision-making, swinging a club the size of a small tree at the sink stalls while Hermione pressed herself against the back wall with both hands over her mouth and the expression of someone who has moved past screaming into the quieter territory beyond it. Lyra assessed in 1 second, troll's range of motion, structural vulnerabilities, ceiling height, available surfaces, Hermione's position relative to the nearest exit path. Harry, she said. Hi. Draw its attention left. He was already moving. He didn't need the breakdown, he needed the direction, vaulting onto the troll's back with a recklessness that she fully supported in this context because recklessness was correct here, grabbing the creature's arm with both hands and hanging, and the troll roared and swung left, off balance. She moved in the gap. Not toward the troll, toward Hermione, fast and low, catching the girl by the arm and pulling her toward the door in the 2 seconds the troll's attention was wrong. Go, she said, pushing Hermione past the door frame. Keep going, don't stop. She turned back. Ron was shouting something, the club was in the air, the troll was about to bring it down with Harry still attached to its arm, and she didn't have time to think and didn't need to, because she raised her wand and cast the only spell that was going to work in this geometry. Wingardium Leviosa. The club rose. She held it, fighting the weight of it with every bit of focused intent she had, the Thunderbird feather pulling hard against the magic's demand. This was not a feather, not a book, the mass was enormous, and she held it for 3 seconds, which was enough. Harry released the troll's arm and dropped. The troll reached up for its suddenly weightless club with the confusion of something that had never had to think about physics before, and she let the spell go. 12 pounds of club dropped directly onto the troll's head. It sat down very slowly and then it lay down and then it made a low, confused sound and stopped moving. The bathroom was very quiet. Harry picked himself up off the floor and looked at the troll and then at her and said, "You held that the whole time." 3 seconds, she said. Any longer and I'd have had to do something more permanent. You could do something more permanent. Let's say yes and not test it, she said, which made him laugh in the startled, relieved way of someone whose adrenaline was still resolving. McGonagall arrived with Snape and Quirrell, and the scene resolved in the predictable way: initial horror, revised understanding, Hermione's unexpected intervention on all their behalves which surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Hermione herself. She had done something brave and slightly unlike herself, Lyra thought, and the doing of it had changed something in her face. She filed this with warmth. Snape's eyes were on her throughout the faculty's examination of the troll, and she stood with her wand at her side and met them without expression, and when he looked at her wand and the angle it was sitting and then back at her, she thought he understood, at least partially, what had actually happened here. He said nothing. Quirrell looked at the troll and then at the bathroom door and then at her, and in the moment when their eyes met she felt it, the cold presence behind his, the one that was calculating, and she gave it nothing, no fear, no recognition, just the calm surface of someone who was filing information, and after 2 seconds it looked away. In bed that night, while the other girls slept, she lay and thought about the troll and about what it had actually been for. Not to hurt anyone specifically. To clear the hall, occupy the teachers, create chaos in a particular part of the castle while attention was elsewhere. While someone went to the 3rd floor. She turned this over carefully. Whatever was on the 3rd floor was being actively sought, not just protected. The timeline was shortening. She needed more information and she needed it faster than her current pace was producing it. She also thought about Hermione's face when she'd lied to McGonagall for them, the way something had unlocked. She made a note, in the private record she kept in the room behind her eyes, Hermione Granger is going to be one of the most important people in this building. Treat her accordingly. November brought Quidditch, and she sat in the stands with Hermione and the Weasley twins and watched Harry play his first match with the critical attention of someone who was also genuinely proud, which was a combination she'd found she could sustain without either cancelling the other. He was extraordinary. There was simply no other word. He moved on the broom with the quality of someone who had been doing it for decades. She knew the feeling, the way the body understands something the mind hasn't fully catalogued yet, and the crowd felt it too, that instinctive recognition of someone doing what they were made for. The broom malfunction started in the 3rd quarter. She saw it before most people did, the subtle wrong quality to the broom's behavior, the way it wasn't responding to Harry's guidance but was fighting it, the specific pattern of the bucking that suggested something external interfering rather than mechanical failure. She tracked it for 4 seconds to confirm the theory and then she started looking for the source. In the stands, someone was not watching the game. Among hundreds of faces angled at the sky, one face was angled down, lips moving with the concentration of a sustained spell. Snape. She looked at this for exactly 1 second and then she made a decision that was, she acknowledged even as she made it, potentially wrong, but the broom was getting worse and Harry was losing his grip and there wasn't time for certainty. She started a fire. Small, controlled, targeted, she lit the hem of Snape's robes, which was what she had and what she could do with a first-year's repertoire applied with unconventional intensity. The point was to break his concentration, not to injure him, and she held it to enough heat to be uncomfortable but not harmful, and she stopped the moment she saw his head snap down. Harry's broom stopped fighting him. He caught the snitch a minute and a half later, nearly swallowing it, and the stadium erupted. In the celebration that followed she stood at the edge of it and thought about what she'd done. She had, she acknowledged, just set a teacher on fire. This was aggressive. It was possibly wrong, she had not confirmed Snape's intent before acting, had not gathered sufficient information, had reacted on a reading that could have been incorrect. She ran the alternative. If she'd waited to be certain, Harry might have fallen from 60 feet. She was at peace with the decision. What she was less at peace with was the question it opened, if it hadn't been Snape, then who had Snape been watching? She'd been so focused on the solution that she hadn't fully considered what Snape had been doing before the malfunction started. She thought about it now, walking back to the castle through the wind, and came to a conclusion she didn't like. Snape had been watching Quirrell. Not performing the counter-curse from a position of power, performing it from the position of someone who was fighting a rearguard action, holding something back. The sustained concentration wasn't the shape of an attack. It was the shape of a defense. She stood in the corridor outside the Great Hall and thought, I may have just burned the robes of the person who was trying to protect Harry. She went to find Hermione. I need to reconsider some things, she said, sitting down across from her in the library with a feeling she recognized as the disciplined discomfort of revising a wrong model. Hermione looked up. About Snape? She looked at Hermione with genuine surprise, which she rarely felt. "How did you? I was watching differently than you," Hermione said. "You were watching Snape. I was watching Quirrell. He wasn't looking at the pitch for the whole of the third quarter. And Snape's lips, a counter-curse has a different movement to a curse. They're opposites in terms of how the mouth forms the words." She paused. "I also noticed the fire, which I'm guessing wasn't an accident." Silence. "I'm going to be extremely honest with you," Lyra said. "Please," Hermione said. "I acted on incomplete information because the timeline was compressed and I prioritized Harry's safety over confirmation. This produced an outcome that was correct in the specific. Harry didn't fall, but may have been wrong in the general, because I may have disrupted a protection rather than an attack." She paused. "I should have had better information before acting." "You had 4 seconds, Hermione said. "That's not an excuse." "No," Hermione agreed. "It's context. There's a difference." She tapped her quill against the table. "So Snape is, what? Protecting you? Protecting Harry? Or protecting whatever's on the third floor from Quirrell?" "All 3 possibilities are live," Lyra said. "And we need to understand the third floor before any of this resolves." Hermione nodded with the decisive quality of someone committing to a course of action. "I've been working on that." She produced a sheaf of notes from her bag, the particular organized density of Hermione's research, which she had come to respect as the most reliable information she had access to. "The third floor corridor. I found a reference in Hogwarts, a history, supplementary edition. There's a reference to a vault room, for objects requiring maximum security. Not a common feature, only installed twice in the school's history. The last time was approximately 15 years ago. Around the time of Voldemort's first fall." "Around that time, yes." Hermione kept her voice neutral over the name, which was more than most people managed. "And there was a break-in at Gringotts this summer. Vault 713. The report said nothing was found, it had already been emptied earlier that day." She absorbed this. "Someone moved something from Gringotts to Hogwarts," she said. "Yes. Something worth protecting with the school's most serious security." "Yes. And Quirrell, or what's using Quirrell, is trying to get to it. And Snape, apparently, is trying to stop him," Hermione finished. They looked at each other across the table. "We need to know what it is," Lyra said. "I think I know," Hermione said carefully. "Nicholas Flamel. I've seen the name somewhere, I haven't found it yet but I will." "Find it," Lyra said. "And find Flamel." She paused. "Hermione. What? You're essential to this," she said plainly, which was not flattery but fact. "What you just showed me, the way you read the Quidditch incident, I missed half of that. I need that perspective." Hermione's expression did something complicated, not quite embarrassed but adjacent, the look of someone who has been valued for what they actually are, which is different from being praised for performing correctly. "Thank you," she said. "For saying that specifically." "I say what's true," Lyra said. "It's more useful than saying what's nice." December arrived with cold and the particular quiet that falls on a school when most of its population goes home for Christmas, and she and Harry stayed because the Dursleys had not been invited to want them and because she had work to do. Ron stayed too, in easy solidarity, and Hermione left for her parents but gave her a list of follow-up research threads with the organized concern of someone making sure the project continued in her absence. The castle was different with fewer people. Not emptier, if anything, more present, the hum of it settling into the spaces that student energy usually occupied. She walked the corridors in the quiet mornings with more freedom than she had during term and found things she'd have needed the full year to locate otherwise, a classroom with an enchanted ceiling that showed not the sky but historical events, a corridor where sound behaved oddly, a staircase that didn't appear on any map she'd found. She found the mirror on the 4th floor in the 2nd week. Not by accident, she'd been tracking an anomaly in the castle's humming for 3 days, a particular vibration that was louder in certain parts of the fourth floor, and she followed it with the systematic patience of someone reading a trail, until she pushed open an unused classroom door and found it. It was massive. Taller than the doorframe should have allowed, framed in ornate gold that had tarnished to something darker, with an inscription running across the top in a running script that took her several seconds to parse backward, "I show not your face but your heart's desire." She stood in front of it and looked at her reflection. For a moment she saw what she expected, herself, 11 years old, amber eyes, the lightning scar above her right eye. And then the reflection shifted, the way her reflection sometimes did in dreams, and she saw her mother. Not Lily Potter. The other one, Ursa, who had left when Azula was 7 and whose face she had spent 30 years trying to forget and never managed. She was standing in the mirror's depths and she was smiling, and it was not the careful, managed smile she'd always worn in front of Ozai, it was the one Azula had seen sometimes when she was very small, before everything became performance, the real one. Beside her, her father, not Ozai, James Potter, young and dark-haired and laughing. And beside him, Lily. And beside Lyra's reflected self, Harry. And in the mirror they were all simply together, which was the thing she had wanted in 2 lifetimes without ever having managed to say so. She looked at it for a long time. She was not, she had established, someone given to sentimentality as a performance, but this was not performance, this was the mirror doing what it said, showing her the thing her heart had been carrying so long it had become part of the architecture. 2 mothers who had left or been taken. A father who had made her into a weapon. A brother she had found again in a second life. She thought about what the Sorting Hat had said. Don't spend this life fighting the last war. I know, she said aloud, to the mirror or to herself or to no one. She reached out and touched the glass, and her reflection reached back, and they pressed palm to palm against a boundary that couldn't be crossed, and she stood there for a moment and let herself grieve, cleanly and deliberately, for the things she had lost and the things she hadn't been given and the things she would have traded anything for. Then she straightened, and breathed, and stepped back. She found Harry 3 hours later. He was in the Gryffindor common room, alone by the fire, and she knew from his face that he'd already been there. The particular quality of his stillness told her, and the brightness at the edges of his eyes that wasn't tears but was close. It shows them, he said. Yes. Our parents. He paused. All 4 of them. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders pressed. Yes. He was quiet for a while. Then, did you cry? No, she said honestly. I did, he said, which didn't surprise her at all. He had a directness with his own emotions that she had spent 2 lifetimes working toward and still didn't fully have. I thought about it, she offered, which was as far as she was willing to go out loud. He leaned his head briefly against her shoulder and she let him, and the fire crackled, and after a moment he said, "What do we do with it?" "Nothing," she said. "We know it's there. We know what it does. We don't go back." He lifted his head. "Why not?" She thought about how to say it. "Because it shows you what you want most, and what you want most is something you can't have. Which means every time you go back you're choosing to stop moving." She paused. "And we have a lot of moving to do." He thought about this with his characteristic full-weight seriousness, turning it over. "Okay," he said. "But, we remember them without the mirror," she said. "We carry them. That's different." He nodded, and the quality of his expression settled into something less raw and more resolved, and she thought, this is what it means to be here for someone, and it was not as difficult as she'd expected, and she was glad. Ron appeared at the top of the dormitory stairs, assessed the room with the quick social fluency she'd come to rely on, and came and dropped onto the floor in front of the fire with his legs crossed and said nothing, which was exactly correct. They sat together in the firelight and after a few minutes someone produced the Weasley twins' contraband hot chocolate that had been living under Ron's bed, and they drank it and talked about nothing in particular, and the castle breathed quietly around them, and it was, she thought, a genuinely good night. She didn't go back to the mirror. Flamel appeared in Hermione's letter 3 days into the new year, enclosed with a note that said she'd found it in a library book she'd had out since September. Nicholas Flamel, alchemist, keeper of the Philosopher's Stone. The only known maker of the elixir of life. She sat with this information for exactly as long as it took her to understand what it meant, and then she wrote Hermione back, "Come back as soon as you can. We have everything. The stone." Someone had moved the Philosopher's Stone from Gringotts to Hogwarts for safekeeping, and whatever lived in Quirrell wanted it, and the obvious reason it wanted it was because it needed to live, properly live, embodied and whole, and the stone was the mechanism. She told Harry and Ron at the first possible moment. "So it's Voldemort," Harry said, without the flinching that most people's voices did around the name, which he had learned from her. "He's been trying to get the stone the whole time." "Quirrell is just a method," she said. "Yes. Can Quirrell get through Dumbledore's protections?" Ron asked. "Not alone," she said. "He's been trying to learn what's in the way." The troll was reconnaissance. He needed the faculty away from the corridor to probe the first layer. "How many layers are there?" "I don't know," she said. "That's the problem. I know the stone is there, I know Quirrell wants it, and I know the system is designed to require specific skill sets to navigate, magical safeguards that vary in type rather than just strength. But I don't know the specifics." Ron was quiet for a moment, and she watched him do the chess player thing, running positions forward in his mind. "If Quirrell can't get through alone," he said slowly, "and Dumbledore's protections are designed for multiple types of magic, then either Quirrell needs help or he needs someone who has all the types. Or, Harry said, he needs one of us." A silence. "The prophecy," Lyra said. Harry nodded. "If there's a prophecy about me and Voldemort, which I think there is, because of how people act around me, then Voldemort might think he needs me for something. Either to kill me or to use you," she finished. "As a component. A sacrifice. Something with your particular magic in it." She thought about the night in the nursery. The rebound. The scars they both bore. "There's something in our blood, Harry. Something that happened that night. The killing curse rebounded because of our mother's protection, love as magic, which is not theoretical, it's documented in several texts, and we carry that." "So does Voldemort want that?" Ron asked. "He wants whatever's in you to help him get the stone." "I think he wants several things," she said. "And his agent in this school is trying to arrange the circumstances to get them." She had been reaching conclusions, connecting threads, and they were connecting in a way she didn't like, not because they were wrong but because they pointed toward a timeline that was shorter than she'd hoped. "We need to go to Dumbledore," Harry said. "Yes," she agreed, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected a more complicated position. "You agree?" "I agree that Dumbledore needs to know we know," she said. "I don't agree that he'll solve it the way we want. But he needs to know we have this information, because otherwise he's operating with incomplete data and that makes his decisions worse." She paused. "We tell him what we know. We see how he responds. His response will tell us everything we need to know about what his actual plan is." They went to see Dumbledore the next morning. The headmaster's office was everything she'd expected, circular, full of whirring instruments and portraits of previous headmasters whose attention settled on her with the weight of people trying to decide what category she fit in. She stood in the middle of the room and felt the space reading her and read it back. Dumbledore looked at them over his glasses with the particular expression she had been cataloging since September, interested, warm, and performing slightly less than he thought he was. He was a man of genuine depth and genuine care and also a man who had, over a very long life, developed certain habits of managing people that had become invisible to him through long use. She intended to make those habits visible. She laid out what they knew. Cleanly, precisely, without editorializing, the stone, Flamel, Quirrell, the timeline of Quirrell's attempts to access the third floor, the Quidditch incident. She included the troll as reconnaissance. She included the fact that she had been monitoring Quirrell since September. She included everything, because incomplete information shared was more dangerous than silence. When she finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "You have been very thorough, Miss Potter," he said, with a warmth that was genuine and something else she was working to name. "We needed to be," she said. "The situation required it." "Indeed." He looked at Harry, then back to her, and she waited with patience she kept off her face. "I want you to know that the stone is very well protected. The safeguards are considerable, and I am confident you're going to be away," Harry said. Dumbledore paused. A very slight pause, but she caught it. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "The timing," Harry said, with the directness he always had. "You told us about the stone's protection in a way that felt like reassurance rather than information. People reassure you when they know they won't be there to reassure you in person." Dumbledore looked at Harry with genuine, unmistakable surprise, and then at her, and she thought, "My brother is remarkable, and you are going to need to understand that," and she held Dumbledore's gaze until he looked back at Harry. "I may need to leave briefly," he acknowledged. "A ministry matter." "Arranged," she said. His eyes moved back to her very quickly. "I beg your pardon." "The ministry matter," she said, keeping her voice entirely even. "I suspect the timing of it is not a coincidence. Someone has arranged it to coincide with a move toward the stone." Another silence, longer this time, and in the silence she watched Dumbledore recalibrate, watched him update his model of who he was sitting across from, and she let him see it happening, not to be intimidating, but because she wanted him to have accurate information. "You are very unusual young people," he said at last. "We are aware," she said. "I want you to promise me something," he said, and his voice had shifted, less the warm headmaster and more simply the person. "Whatever happens, whatever you learn, you will not go into that corridor. The danger there is not merely physical." "We understand the danger," Harry said. "We've understood it since October." Dumbledore looked at them both for a long, careful moment. Then he nodded, slowly. "I will make arrangements to address the Quirrell situation directly," he said. "I should have moved sooner. That is my error, and I acknowledge it." She had not expected that, the direct acknowledgement, and she filed it. Dumbledore, when directly confronted with someone who could not be handled, would admit fault and adjust. This was significant and relatively rare in people with his degree of power. "Thank you," she said. "In the meantime," he said, and the warmth was back, but it was something different now, more honest, she thought, or at least aware that she could see the difference. "I would ask that you continue to bring me information as you gather it. Consider it a collaborative arrangement." "We can do that," Harry said, and meant it completely, which she appreciated because it was also strategically correct. They left the office and walked down the moving spiral staircase and into the corridor, and Harry said, "He's going to be away on the 22nd. "Yes," she said. "Do you think it's a trap? Someone pulling him away?" "Probably," she said. "But I also think Dumbledore knows it's a trap and is deciding whether the trap is worth leaving to spring." "Why would he do that?" "Because," she said carefully, "there are people who think a controlled confrontation is better than an open-ended threat. Who think sometimes you let the thing happen, in a situation you've prepared, because the alternative is an endless waiting." She paused. "I don't disagree with the logic. I disagree with using us as the catalyst without asking." He understood this immediately. "He doesn't want us involved. He wants us to be the reason Voldemort acts," she said. "Without us being in actual danger. That's the plan, I think, draw Voldemort out, toward the stone, when the conditions are controlled." She paused again. "The problem is he doesn't control all the conditions. We're conditions he hasn't calculated," Harry said slowly. "We are," she confirmed. They walked in silence for a moment, and then Harry said, "So what do we do?" "We prepare," she said, for the 100th time, but with a different quality. This time it was more specific, more urgent. "We know the rough timeline. We know the shape of the protections. They'll be layered by magical type, designed for specific skill sets. which means we start working on the broadest possible range of spells we can master in the time we have. We're 12, Ron said from behind them, which made them both look back. He'd been on the staircase too, apparently, silent enough to have been missed. We're 12, she agreed. And we have 2 months. Let's see what 12 can actually do. February was cold and very productive. They trained in the evenings, in an empty classroom on the 5th floor that she'd found in January, large enough for practical work, removed enough from common traffic routes that disturbances were minimal. Hermione had returned from Christmas with the flannel information and the particular energy of someone who had spent 2 weeks thinking intensely about a problem and was ready to act on it, and they were, she thought, a genuinely remarkable group. She taught them the principles she'd developed, the cross-disciplinary approach, the understanding of magical form and intent that she'd spent years working out, and they taught her things in return. Hermione's systematic mastery of charms theory filled gaps she hadn't known she had. Ron's tactical thinking caught blind spots in her operational planning. Harry had been working with her on wandless intent exercises, the kind she'd been developing since she'd understood that her relationship with magic was not quite standard, and his progress was faster than anyone she'd have expected. He reached for magic the way she had once reached for fire, through the body rather than the mind, and the results were startling. She was working on something she hadn't told any of them about yet. The lightning. She had been reaching for it since October, in the quiet practice she kept private, the instinct she'd carried from her first life, the particular way she'd understood energy as a path rather than a force. Wandless, wordless, the kind of magic that lived below the system of spells and sat in the raw material of what she was. She had felt it building since the night at Gringotts when she'd held the Thunderbird's magic in her hand and felt the atmospheric charge in it like a greeting. She was not ready to test it yet. But she was getting close. In the meantime she mastered the curriculum at a rate that she kept deliberately below her maximum, not to hide her ability, but because she had found that moving ahead at full speed left no room for the kind of deep understanding that was actually useful. She watched Hermione make this mistake occasionally, racing to the end of a spell's mechanics without sitting with the theory long enough to understand when the mechanics might fail, and she tried to model something different. Quirrell watched her, when she was in his class, with the cold attention of the thing behind his eyes. She returned the watch with complete equanimity. Whatever Voldemort thought of her was useful information, and she found she was not afraid of his attention, which she knew was unusual and which she suspected had something to do with having already died once. The feeling of being watched by him was not comfortable. She held the discomfort and did not let it change her behavior, which was, she had found, the most effective response to intimidation of any kind. Spring came, and with it the end-of-term pressure and the thing she'd been tracking since December coming to a head, and on the night she'd predicted, a Tuesday in early June, the 20th, 2 days before Dumbledore's ministry summons, she woke from sleep with the particular quality of alertness that meant her threat assessment had resolved something in the night. Tonight, she thought. He's going to move tonight. She sat up in the dark of the dormitory and felt the castle and felt the wrongness in it, something at the 3rd floor that was not the normal hum but something displaced, the castle's attention pulling upward like a compass needle swinging. She dressed efficiently and went to Harry's dormitory door and knocked once, quietly. He opened it inside 15 seconds. Already dressed. You felt it too, she said. 3rd floor, he said. Something's wrong. We need the others. She was already turning. Ron first, he's fastest, then Hermione, what about Dumbledore? Harry said, which was the right question. Gone already, she said. I checked the window from the landing, his phoenix isn't in the tower. He absorbed this and then nodded. Right. Let's go. Ron emerged from his room still pulling a jumper over his head, took one look at their faces, and said, okay. Hermione met them at the portrait hole with her wand already out and the particular expression of someone who had also been lying awake. I calculated the timing 3 days ago, Hermione said. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Lyra looked at her. You calculated it too. 21st or 22nd, Hermione said. The ministry summons is dated the 22nd. So tonight. Right, Lyra said. She looked at all of them, Harry with his steady readiness, Ron with his grounded practicality, Hermione with her focused intelligence, and felt something she had felt before, in another life, before the best battles, not fear, but the clean clarity of a situation becoming simple. Here's what we're doing. We go to the corridor. We assess what we find. We do not engage anything beyond our capability, we've been thorough, we've prepared, but we work within what we know. She paused. And we look after each other. Above anything else. Obviously, Harry said, which settled something in her. They went. The third floor was quiet in the way that meant everyone with sense was elsewhere. The door at the end of the corridor was unlocked, already unlocked, meaning someone had been through, and she pushed it open and the sound hit them, breathing, enormous, from three enormous heads on one enormous body. The Cerberus was asleep. She looked at the harp playing itself in the corner, faintly, slowing, the enchantment degrading at the edges, and she understood, Quirrell had been through, had used music to send the creature to sleep, and was already in the tunnel below. The harp, Harry said quietly. Already on it, Hermione murmured, and produced a small music box from her bag. She had thought of this, had prepared it, and Lyra felt a surge of genuine appreciation at the foresight, and set it on the floor and wound it, and the music picked up seamlessly. The trapdoor was underneath the dog's feet, and they navigated around the sleeping creature with the careful precision of people who understood that the window was closing. The trapdoor gave, and below it was dark, and she dropped first without a second thought. The devil's snare caught her and she was still before the reflex to struggle had formed. She knew what this was, she'd read about it, and she went completely, deliberately, entirely limp and felt the plant's grip ease. Beside her Harry did the same, and Ron, and Hermione produced light with the natural authority of someone who did this in her sleep, and the plant recoiled. They kept moving. The winged key's chamber was hers, she decided in the first 5 seconds, the flight logic was hers, the three-dimensional tracking of which key matched which keyhole required the kind of spatial assessment that Harry could have done on a broom but which she could do standing still, watching the swarm, finding the old worn one with the bent wing that matched the lock. She pointed it out to Harry and he went up on his broom. They'd brought brooms, she'd insisted on brooms, and the decision was validated immediately, and he swept through the chamber with the total confidence of someone doing the thing they were made for, and the key was caught and the door unlocked and they moved. The chess set was Ron's, and he saw it immediately. She watched him take the board in, watched his eyes move across the pieces with the particular quality of someone reading a position in a foreign language and finding it translatable, and then he said, "Right. I know what to do. You're going to be pieces." He looked at her. "You need to go ahead." She understood this the moment he said it. "You stay with him," she told Harry. No, Harry said. "I'll stay. You go." She looked at him. "You're faster," he said. "You understand what we're dealing with better than I do. And," he met her eyes directly, "you won't freeze." She held his gaze for 2 seconds, and then she said, "Ron." "I've got him," Ron said immediately. "Go." She crossed the chess board with Ron's direction and felt the pieces move around her with the particular menace of things built for violence, and she trusted Ron's positioning completely and was through the far door before the Queen's gambit resolved. The troll was already dealt with, unconscious, which meant Quirrell had come through and she was on his timeline, and she went through the next door into the purple flame room, and she looked at the potions lined up on the shelf and the riddle on the table, and she sat down and solved it in under 2 minutes. Because logic was logic, and drank the smallest bottle, and went through. The mirror of Eriste was there. And in front of it, Quirrell. And in Quirrell's reflection, something that was not Quirrell at all. She walked into the room at normal speed, and Quirrell turned, and on his face was the surprise of someone who had expected a different variable. Behind his eyes, the thing that was not him assessed her with a cold intelligence that she met head-on, and there was a moment, 1 second, 2, of pure, mutual, absolutely honest sizing up. "The sister," said the voice that was not Quirrell's and was not using his stutter at all. "What's left of him," she agreed pleasantly. You are not what you appear, said Voldemort, through Quirrell's mouth, with the quality of someone making an observation rather than a threat, and she thought, no, you're not wrong about that. Neither are you, she said. Currently. You know what I want, he said. The stone, she said. To rebuild your body. To return. She looked at the mirror, which she had been carefully not looking at, because she knew what it would show her. You're going to ask me to get it for you. I was going to persuade you, he said, and there was something in the voice, the intelligence of it, real and cold and absolute, that she respected as dangerous even as she refused to fear it. You are not ordinary. I can give you everything, she suggested. Power, knowledge, life beyond the normal span. You offered Quirrell something similar, I imagine. A pause. You are mocking me. I'm not, she said honestly. I find you interesting. A person who chose power so absolutely that they burned away everything else, I understand that choice better than most. She looked at him steadily. It doesn't end well. You don't know where my story ends. I know where it's going, she said. The stone is in the mirror. You can't get it because you can't want it for the right reasons. The mirror gives the stone only to someone who wants to find it, not use it, and you cannot want to find it without also wanting to use it. That's the trap. Dumbledore is clever. Quirrell's face moved through several expressions. And you, he said. Could you get it? She looked at the mirror. In the mirror, she saw herself. Not a family, not the dead, not any of the things the mirror had shown her before, just herself, standing exactly where she was standing, in a world that had been made rather than inherited, and in the mirror's version of her hands was nothing at all. No weapons. No power. Just her hands, open. She felt something fall into her pocket. She did not reach for her pocket. She kept her eyes on Quirrell and she said, no. I can't. It was a lie, and Voldemort knew it was a lie, and she knew that he knew, and she held her ground and her expression and the silence between them stretched out to its limit. Then Quirrell lunged. She moved before he reached her, not back but sideways, the movement pattern of someone who had spent years fighting people much larger and faster, and she caught his wrist as he grabbed for her and felt pain. Not her pain, his. Quirrell screamed, a real, genuine scream, and she held on, because the pain was his and the information was useful, and she understood in the moment of contact what she'd felt as a child in the nursery and what she carried in her blood, her mother's protection, baked into her very skin, and for whatever was wearing Quirrell's body, she was simply, physically, unbearable. She held his wrist until he collapsed. She stood in the chamber and breathed carefully and felt the stone in her pocket and felt the castle around her, the hum of it high and urgent, and she thought, we won this round. And Dumbledore is going to have a great deal to think about. Quirrell was unconscious. What had been in him was gone, she could feel the absence, the particular emptiness of a room after something leaves, and she stood alone in the chamber with the mirror of Eriste showing her nothing but her own reflection, open-handed, and she was not afraid. She was many things. She was 2 lifetimes old and 12 years of body and the last of a fire that had started in another world. She was standing in a room at the end of a fight she'd been building towards since September, holding a stone that could make anyone live forever, and she felt no desire to keep it. She took it out of her pocket and looked at it. Red, smooth, warm, the warmth of something very old that had been many things. She put it back in her pocket. She'd give it to Dumbledore. She'd have things to say about the system that had gotten them here. She'd have things to say about being used as an instrument without consultation, even benevolently. But for now she walked back through the flames and back through the chess room, and she heard Harry before she saw him. He was helping Ron, who had taken a hit from the Queen that was going to leave significant bruising, and she crossed to them and crouched in front of Ron and said, "You played an exceptional game." "Did you get it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He sagged with the relief of someone who had given something real and was grateful it had been worth giving. Harry looked at her from over his shoulder and she held up 3 fingers. "3 of us," she meant, all three of us made it through, and his face broke into the full, open, entirely unguarded grin that was the best sight in either of her lives. "Ready to go talk to the headmaster," he said. "I have several things to say to the headmaster," she said, standing up. "I know you do," he said, warmly, and Ron laughed despite his bruising, and she pulled them both up, and they went. Chapter 4. The weight of 2 crowns. The hospital wing smelled like potions and clean linen, and Dumbledore sat in the chair beside Ron's bed with the particular quality of someone who had come to deliver both gratitude and a reckoning, and she intended to have both on her terms. Ron was mostly fine. The Queen had clipped him across the shoulder and his collarbone was cracked. Madame Pomfrey had fixed it with the brisk confidence of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had long since run out of patience for the drama of injury. He was propped up on pillows eating a truly remarkable quantity of Honeyduke's chocolate that the Weasley twins had produced seemingly from nowhere, in the way that the twins produced most things, as though they had simply always existed and were merely being revealed. Harry sat at the foot of Ron's bed. She sat in the window alcove, close enough to be present, positioned to see everyone in the room at once, which was a habit she would probably have forever. Dumbledore looked at the three of them with the expression she'd been waiting to see, the full, unmanaged version of his regard, without the performing headmaster layered over it. He looked tired and old and genuinely moved, and he looked at her specifically with something that was not quite apology but was adjacent to it. "The stone," he said, to her. She produced it from her pocket and held it out without ceremony. "Intact," she said. "Quirrell is in the lower chambers. He was unconscious when I left him. I don't know the current status of what was using him, I felt it leave, but I have no data on where it went." Dumbledore took the stone with both hands and closed his fingers around it and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up. "Tell me," he said, and his voice was simply a man asking, not a headmaster managing. "Everything. From the beginning." So she told him. She had been building this account since September, organizing it, selecting what was relevant, and she delivered it with the concision of someone who had spent considerable time in situations where accurate reporting was the difference between winning and not. She included everything, including the fire she'd set on his robes at the Quidditch match, for which she neither apologized nor minimized. When she finished, the room was quiet except for Ron eating chocolate. "You've been running an independent intelligence operation since September," Dumbledore said. "We've been gathering information relevant to our own safety," she said. "And yours, as it happens." "Yes." He turned the stone over in his hands. "And you chose to come to me rather than move unilaterally." "I came to you when I had enough information to make the conversation useful," she said. "I came to you again tonight because I calculated we were operating in the same timeline and it was better to coordinate than to be in each other's way." He looked at her for a long moment. She held it steadily, because she had nothing to be uncomfortable about. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "How old are you?" He said it without irony, without the condescending gentleness that adults usually brought to the question. He said it with the genuine inquiry of someone who had noticed something and was asking directly. She considered this question carefully. 12, she said. "In this body." In experience, she paused, and made a deliberate choice, older than 12. He held her gaze. "I see," he said quietly, and she thought he might, at least partially, because Albus Dumbledore had lived a very long time and encountered a great many unusual things and knew the difference between a child who was exceptional and something that was not quite what it appeared. "What will happen to the stone?" Harry asked, which was Harry, letting her have the primary conversation and stepping in when there was something else that needed addressing. "Nicholas and I discussed this some time ago," Dumbledore said. "The stone will be destroyed." Ron stopped eating chocolate. "Destroyed?" Flamel will die. "He and his wife have had 600 years, Dumbledore said, gently. "They are, I think, prepared." A pause. "There are things worse than death, and living forever in fear of those who would take what you have is one of them." She thought about this and agreed with it and also noted that Dumbledore had a complicated relationship with the topic, being as old as he was and having his own history with the subject of mortality. She kept this thought private. "And Quirrell," Harry said. What happened to him?" "He is alive," Dumbledore said, carefully. "The connection to Voldemort's fragment cost him considerably, and he will require significant recovery. But alive." He looked at Harry and then at her. "What you felt at the nursery, whatever protection Lily and James's sacrifice created, runs in both of you. It is an extraordinarily rare form of magic. The old kind. Love as a spell," she said. "Love as a fact," Dumbledore said, gently, and the distinction was meaningful enough that she let it sit without reframing it. He stayed another 20 minutes. He asked questions she answered honestly, gave information she assessed as accurate, and by the time he left she had a significantly updated model of Albus Dumbledore, someone more self-aware than she'd given him credit for, more willing to be taught, and genuinely, authentically caring in a way that didn't cancel out his more complicated habits but did make them more forgivable. She was not naive enough to consider him an ally without reservation. But she was honest enough to recognize genuine quality when she saw it. When he was gone, Ron said, "You're going to run the whole world by the time you're 30, aren't you?" 25, Harry said, without looking up. "Realistically 20, she said, and Ron laughed so hard he pulled his collarbone healing and had to be reminded by Madame Pomfrey to lie still, and Harry caught her eye with the warm, crooked look he had when she said something that was both true and slightly alarming, and she let herself smile back, all the way, which she was getting better at. Summer was the Dursleys again, which she managed with the efficient calm of someone who had survived considerably worse accommodation. She used the time well. She wrote letters, to Hermione, whose replies were thorough and excellent, to Ron, whose replies were brief but consistently observant, occasionally to the twins, who wrote back in a rotating series of codes she cracked within 4 minutes each time and eventually stopped pretending to need, and she read, and she practiced, and she thought about the year ahead. She also thought about what Dumbledore had said. The old kind. She had been working on something for 8 months and it was becoming real. In the garden, very early in the mornings before the house woke, she would stand in the dew-wet grass and extend her magic downward and outward and up, feeling for the atmospheric charge that the Thunderbird feather in her wand had been responding to since October. It was there, it was always there, she just needed to reach far enough, and she pulled it through herself in a controlled trickle, learning the shape of it, the way it wanted to move. Lightning was not fire. Fire had warmth in it, life in it, the quality of something that wanted to exist and could be coaxed. Lightning was different, it was energy looking for a path, pure and indifferent and very fast, and you didn't coax it so much as become the path it was already looking for. She understood this, at a deep level that was older than her current body. On the 43rd morning of the summer, standing in the garden at 5:30 with the first light coming grey over the Dursley hedges, she raised her hand without her wand and let the charge move through her from ground to sky. The lightning that left her fingertips was blue. She stood very still in the aftermath, smelling ozone, looking at the scorch mark on the garden wall, and thought about this for a very long time. "There," she said to no one in particular. "There we are." She went inside and made herself breakfast and did not mention it to anyone, yet. She needed to understand it better before she brought it to Harry, because Harry would want to help with it immediately and she needed to be certain it was safe to be around when he did. She also thought, over the summer, about the year that was coming. She had gathered enough information about the wizarding world's recent history to have a working model of the landscape, Voldemort not dead, not embodied, existing in some in-between state having lost his stone. The Death Eaters, his followers, dispersed but not abandoned, mostly claiming they'd been under the Imperious curse, mostly believed or at least accepted by a ministry that preferred the easier narrative. The political structure fractured along bloodlines and money in the predictable ways power always fractured when the thing that had unified it against a common enemy collapsed. The thing she understood, that she was not sure anyone else was thinking about clearly, was that Voldemort would come back. Not might, would. The will she had felt behind Quirrell's eyes was not the will of something that accepted defeat. It would find another method, and it would try again, and next time it would come better prepared and with more information about what was in its way. She intended to be more prepared than it. She was also thinking about Hogwarts itself. The first year had given her a functioning map of the institution, its social structure, its power dynamics, its physical layout, its gaps and its strengths. The second year would give her the opportunity to build on that map in ways that a first year couldn't. She had plans. Specific plans. She thought about the Chamber of Secrets. September 1st arrived with King's Cross and the Weasleys in their usual wonderful chaos and Hermione at the barrier with a new beaded bag and a quality of controlled excitement she recognized as the energy of someone who had spent the summer productively. "You look well," Hermione said, assessing her with the directness that Lyra appreciated. "I had a good summer," she said, which was true in the ways that mattered. "Did you practice?" "Extensively." "Anything new?" She looked at Hermione steadily. "I'll show you when we're somewhere appropriate." Hermione's eyes narrowed with the specific sharpening of someone whose interest has been precisely targeted. "How new?" "Very," she said. She found Harry and Ron at the barrier, and the twins behind them, and Mrs. Weasley distributing sandwiches and concern in equal measure, and she stood in the familiar chaos and felt the particular warmth of it, the bigness of the Weasley family, the way it filled space not with volume but with genuine affection that was loud and constant and entirely unperformative. She had been, she acknowledged to herself, absorbing this family all year. Studying how it worked the way she studied most things, because she had not had a model for it and models were how she learned. She filed each new observation and built her understanding of what it meant to be loved like this, without condition, without performance, without it costing you anything to accept. She was getting better at accepting it. On the train, she had the compartment and the usual crew and the additional presence of Ginny Weasley, Ron's younger sister, who was red-haired and bright-eyed and vibrating with contained first-year excitement and terror in approximately equal measure. She sat beside the window and looked out with the determinately casual expression of someone trying not to look like they were trying not to cry. Lyra looked at her for approximately 30 seconds and then moved to sit across from her. "First years always have the same expression," she said conversationally. "As though Hogwarts might somehow reject them at the door." Ginny looked at her with the particular startled look of someone who has been directly addressed when they expect it to be peripheral. "I'm not," she started. "It won't," Lyra said. "The castle decides quickly about people. You'll know within a week." Ginny blinked. "How do you know?" "The castle told me," she said, which was true in an oblique way that she wasn't going to explain on a train. She watched Ginny process this and decide whether it was strange enough to worry about, and apparently decide not. "What are you most interested in?" "Academically." "Charms," Ginny said, with the immediacy of someone who has had an answer waiting. "And, well, I'd like to play Quidditch." "But it's first year, and, get on the team," Lyra said. "If you're good enough, age doesn't matter." "You think I should just, I think you should be exactly as capable as you are and not apologize for it," Lyra said. "You've grown up around 5 older brothers. You know more than most first years. Use it." Ginny looked at her with something that was halfway between startlement and recognition, and Lyra thought, "This one. Watch this one." The return to Hogwarts felt different in the way that second times always differed from firsts. She had more context now, and context changed the quality of experience. She walked through the entrance hall with the settled authority of someone who knew the building's rhythms and could feel when they were normal or not, and the castle's hum greeted her like a familiar voice. She also noticed the arrival of the Malfoys. Lucius Malfoy was precisely what she'd expected from Draco's references and her own reading: tall, blonde, expensive, wearing authority the way people wore it when they'd never had to earn it, as a given rather than an achievement. He stood just inside the entrance hall speaking to the Weasley patriarch with the quality of someone enjoying the performance of contempt, and she watched his face with the attention she gave all power dynamics. Smart, she assessed. Politically intelligent, genuinely so. Dangerously so, because political intelligence without scruple was a specific and serious kind of weapon. He believed what he believed about blood purity with the conviction of someone who had never had cause to examine the belief, not because he was stupid, but because his whole life had been structured to confirm it. She watched him speak to Arthur Weasley and she thought, this man will be a problem, and not in the obvious way. Draco caught her eye from behind his father, and the look on his face was the complicated one, the version she'd been cataloging for a year, the one that existed between the performance he gave his family and the person who occasionally surfaced when the performance slipped. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, gave him a minimal nod, and looked away. He looked, she thought, slightly relieved. Defense against the dark arts had a new teacher. Gilderoy Lockhart arrived at Hogwarts with the energy of a man who had spent 20 years converting his face into a brand, and she assessed him in 4 minutes flat. Phenomenal memory charm practitioner, near certainly the actual mechanism behind every adventure in his books, comprehensive fraud at every other level, and operating with the particular confidence of someone who had never been caught at something they knew was wrong. She sat in his first class and listened to him describe his adventures with the Banshee of Dundee and thought, he didn't do any of that. He found the person who did, removed the memory, and wrote the book. She was not angry about this. She was interested in the memory charm, which was clearly extraordinary, sustained, precise, undetectable after the fact, deployed on numerous occasions without discovery. Whatever else Lockhart was, he had spent years developing one specific magical skill to an exceptional level, and that skill was worth studying. She asked him about Obliviate in the 3rd class. The mechanics, she said, when he'd been describing his encounter with a Transylvanian vampire for long enough that the class's attention was beginning to drift. Memory charm mechanics, specifically, the precision question. How do you target a specific memory without affecting adjacent associations? They're neurologically entangled, so a blunt charm would take more than intended. Lockhart looked at her with the expression of someone who has been asked a question they were not expecting and is working out whether the question makes him look good or bad. Very advanced thinking, Miss Potter, he said, which was his answer to everything. Is it precision of intent? She continued. Or is there a specific incantation variant that narrows the effect scope? He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she saw behind the performance, not much, just a flicker, the real man making a quick calculation, and he said, intent and visualization. You must hold a very exact mental image of what you want removed. Too broad and you get, he stopped. Extensive collateral damage, she said. Quite, he said, and moved on, and she thought, there. He knows. He's done it wrong before and he knows what wrong looks like. She wrote this down in the inside of her notes under a heading she didn't label, and next to it she wrote, Memory charm, precision. Intent-based targeting. Requires clear mental model of specific memory structure. Collateral risk. This information was not going to be useful tomorrow. But she collected things that might be useful eventually, because eventually always came. The year settled into its rhythm, and she paid particular attention to 2 threads running through it. The first was the attacks. She heard about the Polyjuice plan from Harry before Hermione had fully committed to it, and she listened to his account and then sat with it and said, tell me where you think this leads. Slytherin's heir, he said. Malfoy's our best candidate. If we can confirm, what do you do if it's not Malfoy? She asked. He paused. Then we look at whoever it is. And if it's not a student at all? He paused longer. Then we've been looking in the wrong place. Right, she said. Which means the Polyjuice plan has value as confirmation of a hypothesis, but we need to be running parallel lines, not putting everything in the one direction. She looked at him. It's a good plan. Do it. I'll work the other line. What's the other line? The chamber itself, she said. If the heir opened it, the heir knows where it is and how to access it. The historical record says Slytherin built it, which means it was built into the school in the founding era, which means there's a connection between the chamber and the castle's fundamental architecture. He absorbed this. You're going to ask the castle. I'm going to ask the castle, she confirmed. She had been building this capability all year, the connection with the castle's hum, the way it attended to her, the developing ability to extend her awareness into its stone and feel what it held. She didn't have words for it in standard magical taxonomy. It might have been a form of legilimency applied to a building, or it might have been something the castle itself was doing, reaching toward the thing that could reach back. She was not certain which, and the distinction was interesting but not currently urgent. She sat against the castle walls in the evenings, in the corridor near the third floor where the hum was clearest, and she reached. The castle was old in a way that was very different from human old. It didn't remember things linearly, sequentially, the way people did. It remembered in layers, the way geological formations held history. Everything that had happened here was still here, compressed and accumulated, accessible if you could find the right pressure point. She looked for Slytherin. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of patient, systematic reaching, sitting against cold stone at odd hours, learning the castle's particular grammar of awareness. And then one evening in mid-October she touched a layer of memory that was very old and very deep and felt the shape of something, not a location exactly, but a direction, and within that direction a resonance with something specific, something that spoke in a language she didn't quite have but could almost follow. Pipes, she thought, and then, of course. The plumbing runs through the whole castle. Something built in the Foundation era would use the infrastructure that already existed. She went to the bathroom on the 2nd floor. The entrance to the chamber was in the 2nd floor girls' bathroom. She found it in 12 minutes of systematic examination, not because she was looking for a tap, but because she was looking for a place where the stone's memory was particularly dense, where something very old had been activated many times. It was the sink. The snake on the faucet. She looked at it, and the castle around her hummed with something she had come to understand as the closest thing it had to confirmation. She did not go in. She noted the location and the mechanism, Parseltongue, which she didn't speak and wouldn't pretend to, but which she now knew was the key, and she went back to the library and pulled every reference she could find on Salazar Slytherin, which was less than she'd have liked, and specifically on what he'd built and what he'd put in it. Basilisk, she found, in a reference in a bound journal from the 1700s written by a magical creature researcher who was documenting second-hand accounts. The Chamber of Secrets, if the accounts are accurate, contains a beast of significant antiquity, a serpent of enormous size, the precise nature of which the accounts describe with the characteristic imprecision of fear rather than observation. The creature is referenced as Slytherin's own, his instrument, his weapon, his legacy. Its primary lethality, according to the accounts, involves the eyes. She sat back from this and thought about what you could survive if you didn't look directly, and what you couldn't. She went to find Hermione. Basilisk, she said, and put the journal in front of her. Hermione read the relevant passage in 20 seconds and her expression moved through recognition and then careful logical assembly. The petrification, she said. Looking at a reflection or through water or through, like nearly headless Nick couldn't die because he's already, the indirect view, Lyra said. Yes. The ones who've been petrified all saw it indirectly. Glasses, water, mirrors, a camera. She paused. And the voice in the walls. A basilisk communicates through the pipes. Parseltongue, Harry might be able to hear it. Did Harry know? I'm telling Harry tonight. I wanted to tell you first because you're going to know fastest what to do with it. Hermione sat very straight. What do we need? Roosters, Lyra said. A basilisk is killed by the crow of a rooster. And mirrors, hand mirrors, enough for everyone to walk the corridors safely without direct eye contact. And we need the entrance confirmed. I know where it is but we need the ability to open it. Harry can speak to the snake, Hermione said. On the faucet. That's the theory, yes. She paused. Also, this is important, whoever the heir is, they've been directing the basilisk from somewhere. Not physically present each time. There's an instrument of some kind. She thought about what she'd read about Tom Riddle, cross-referenced against what she knew about soul magic and the particular category of dark artifacts that could sustain a form of consciousness. Something that contains them. Or part of them. Contained consciousness, Hermione said slowly. Think about it, Lyra said. If you wanted to leave a piece of yourself behind, to survive, to maintain a presence in the world even if your body was gone, what would you use? Hermione looked at her. That's how Voldemort survived, isn't it? From last year. Not just the nursery magic. He'd already done something to himself. That's my working theory, she said. Yes. She paused. Which means there's an object in this school that contains a piece of him. A younger version, the version that was Tom Riddle, before he became what he became. And that version is controlling the basilisk. The silence was the particular kind that follows a large thing being said. Where is it? Hermione said. I don't know yet, she said. But I know who it's working through. She paused, because this was the part she'd been sitting with, the part that was complicated. It's not Malfoy. Harry's Polyjuice plan will confirm that Malfoy is not the heir, she said. Which is useful, because it eliminates a hypothesis. But I need to know who the instrument is working through. Someone opened the chamber. Someone inside the school has access to it, or to the memory inside the object. Ginny, Hermione said. Lyra looked at her. I've been watching her, Hermione said, carefully. She's been off since September. There was a diary that Percy found her with once, she nearly took it from him, very out of character. She's been pale and exhausted and she doesn't remember things sometimes. A pause. I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain. Ginny Weasley is carrying an object that contains Tom Riddle's consciousness, Lyra said, not as a question. I think so, Hermione said. Which means she's not doing this consciously. She's being used. She thought about this for a moment, about what it felt like to be used, to be made into an instrument by someone who called themselves your family or your friend or your protector. She thought about the particular loneliness of it, the way you couldn't explain what was happening because you didn't understand it yourself. We need to get the diary, she said, and we need to destroy it, and we need to do it before Ginny is blamed for something she hasn't chosen to do. How do we get it without tipping Riddle off? We don't concern ourselves with tipping Riddle off, she said. We concern ourselves with Ginny. She stood up. Tonight. I'm going to talk to her. Carefully, Hermione said. I'm always careful, Lyra said. You are very rarely careful, Hermione said. You are very often precise, which is different. She paused and looked at Hermione, who looked back with the expression of someone who has said an accurate thing and will not apologize for it. Fair, she said, and went. Ginny was in the common room, in a corner by herself with the specific posture of someone who had been trying to be invisible for weeks. She had the look of a girl who wasn't sleeping, not the dramatic version, but the hollowed-out, subtle version that Lyra recognized because she had worn it herself for stretches of her first life when she'd been pushing herself past sustainable limits. She sat beside her without announcement and said, "The diary." Ginny went very still. "I'm not angry," Lyra said. "I need you to know that first." "I don't," Ginny started. "You don't have to protect anyone," Lyra said. "Not me, not it. I need to know where it is." Ginny looked at her. In the firelight, her eyes were frightened in a specific way, the fear of someone who suspects they have done something terrible and can't quite put together the sequence of events that led to it. "I don't know what you're, Ginny." She said it quietly and directly. "You've been writing in a diary that writes back. Whatever it tells you about itself, it isn't your friend. It's using you to move around this school, and you're not responsible for what it's made you do, but I need it. Where is it?" The silence stretched out long enough that she thought Ginny might not answer, and then Ginny said, very quietly, "In my trunk. I've been trying to get rid of it but it comes back." She nodded. "Will you get it now?" Ginny looked at her for a long moment, the look of someone deciding whether to trust, and she watched the calculation happen and held very still and let it resolve without pushing. Trust that was pushed was not trust, it was compliance, and she knew the difference in both directions. Yes, Ginny said. She brought it down in 5 minutes, small, old, water-damaged, the kind of object that looked innocuous until you understood what it was. Lyra held it and felt the wrongness of it immediately, the cold intelligence living inside, and she thought, there you are. 50 years old and still running the same game. She set it on the table. What are you going to do with it? Ginny asked. Destroy it, she said. But first I want to see what it knows. She opened it and wrote. The ink disappeared and the handwriting appeared, formal, elegant, slightly too perfect in the way of someone who had practiced their performance of themselves. Hello, wrote Tom Riddle. Who are you? She wrote her name. The pause before his response was perceptible, even in a diary. Lyra Potter, he wrote. I know your name. I know yours, she wrote. Tom Marvolo Riddle. Though you prefer Voldemort now. Anagram. Somewhat theatrical. Another pause. You're more interesting than the girl, he wrote, and she thought, yes, I imagine I am, and you're going to try to use that. I'm not going to be interesting in any way that's useful to you, she wrote. I want to know one thing and then this conversation is over. What would that be? The chamber. You built it into the school using a specific access mechanism. How many access points are there? A long pause. What makes you think I'll tell you? Because you're going to try to get out of this diary through me, she wrote, and you know I understand that, and you know the only thing that might work is giving me something useful enough that I let curiosity keep me engaged. The question is whether the access point information is expensive enough to buy you enough time. She paused, then added, it isn't. But tell me anyway and I'll at least be honest that I considered it. The temperature in the book seemed to change. Then, one entrance. The bathroom. A second point, disused, blocked by a cave-in in 1942. What blocked it? A structural failure I caused, he wrote, and she could feel the pride in it even through paper and ink. I was 16. Useful, she wrote. Goodbye, Tom. She closed the diary and looked at it for a moment and then she looked at Ginny. Can you get me a basilisk fawn? Ginny stared. That was a joke, she said. Partially. She turned the diary over. I know another way. She destroyed the diary in the chamber itself, which she decided was appropriate. She had brought Harry because he was the one who could open the entrance. The Parseltongue came instinctively when he stood before the snake-carved faucet and she watched the magic respond with the smooth, deep opening of something very old being correctly addressed. He hadn't known he could speak Parseltongue until the moment the sound came out of him, and his expression was the baffled, slightly alarmed look of someone discovering a room in themselves they hadn't known was there. Did I just? Yes, she said. We'll discuss it later. Go. She'd brought the copper pipe she'd prepared. It took 3 evenings to get right, the particular combination of compression and atmospheric charge, and she'd brought basilisk antidote from the potion stores, which she'd reasoned she had a right to given the circumstances. The chamber was extraordinary. She gave herself 3 seconds to acknowledge this: the long stone passage, the skull-shaped doorways, the water on the floor, the deep structural oldness of it, and then she moved past the aesthetic and into the operational. Mirrors. She and Harry both had hand mirrors, and they walked the corridor watching their reflections rather than looking ahead, and she could hear the basilisk before she could see it, the massive sound of something enormous moving through water. She threw the diary into the open space ahead and shouted, now. The roosters were not, strictly speaking, in the chamber, they were above it, in the bathroom, the sound traveling down through the pipe she'd opened. She had arranged this with a great deal of creative problem-solving and one very confused Hagrid who had been persuaded that there was a very good reason she needed 6 roosters in the second-floor bathroom and that he absolutely should not mention this to anyone. The crow hit the chamber like a thunderclap. The sound the basilisk made when it stopped moving was the most enormous sound she had ever heard, and she stood in the mirror view and waited until the silence was complete, and then she turned and looked at what the diary was doing. It was open. Tom Riddle was, partially, incompletely, there, in the same way the mirror had once shown her something that was not quite physical, a transparency of a person insisting on existing. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was young, which she had known but which was still striking. 16, maybe 17, the age she had been in her first life when she had been at her most powerful and also her most brittle, and she understood him in a way that was deeply uncomfortable because she had been close, once, to the thing he chose. "You're different," he said, and his voice had the quality of something that had been studying you from a distance and is surprised by the close-up. "I know," she said. "You destroyed Quirrell," he said. "My future self's current vessel. I stopped him from getting the stone," she said. "His choices after that weren't mine." He looked at her with the particular, precise calculation of genuine intelligence pointed at a problem it finds interesting. "You could have taken the stone." "I know," she said again. "Why didn't you?" "Because I know what the wanting becomes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she saw something move across his face, not regret, not conscience, not anything that simple, but something like recognition, the thing a mirror does when it shows you something you didn't know you were carrying. "You're going to destroy me," he said. "I'm going to destroy the diary," she said. "You're not entirely the same thing as the diary." "But yes. You could talk to me instead," he said, and his voice had the quality of genuine plea woven through the performance of it, which she thought was the most honest he could be. "You understand things no one else here does. You could learn from me." She looked at him for a long moment. 16, brilliant, utterly alone with the worst things he'd found to do with it. "I know," she said, for the third time. "That's why." She raised her wand. Fiend fire. She had spent 6 months carefully learning this, and she had learned it well, contained, targeted, the smallest possible application of the destructive flame that was not like fire but was the opposite of fire, the consuming kind. It hit the diary and the diary burned, and Tom Riddle's form came apart with the quality of something that was both an object and a scream, and she held the fiend fire precisely and let it consume exactly what she'd aimed it at and nothing else, and then she ended the spell. The chamber was silent. She stood in the water and the dark and the deep old smell of the place and breathed, and Harry stood beside her, and after a while he said, "Fiend fire." "We can talk about that later too," she said. "How long have you been sitting on fiend fire?" 4 months, she said. "Lyra." "I needed to be certain I could control it before I demonstrated it," she said, which was entirely reasonable, and she would defend it. "And I needed the application." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, startled, helpless, genuine, and she thought, yes, there it is, that's why. Not the power. Not the victory. The way this felt, standing in an ancient chamber with her brother, having done something real and difficult, hearing him laugh in the dark. "Come on," she said. "We have to talk to Dumbledore." "Again," he said. "Again," she agreed. Dumbledore's expression when they gave him their account this time was different from the first. It was the expression of someone who has received a significant recalibration of their understanding and is sitting very still while they update their model. She watched him process it with respect. He was fast, for someone who had spent 80 years building assumptions, and he adjusted without the defensive rigidity that usually accompanied being wrong. "A Horcrux," he said quietly, when she described the diary. She looked at him. "Is that what it's called?" "That is what the theory describes," he said. "I had suspected. I had not confirmed." He looked at her. "You have confirmed it." "There will be more," she said. He made more. "I don't know how many, the magic required is," she paused, choosing words, "considerable and costly." "But he made the diary when he was 16. He had decades after that." Dumbledore was quiet for a very long time. "You understand," he said eventually, "that this changes the nature of the problem significantly." "I understand," she said. He cannot die while they exist. I know, she said. Which means before any direct confrontation is possible, we need to find them. All of them. She paused. I'm assuming you have some knowledge of what they might be. He looked at her. The quality of his regard had changed over the course of this conversation. It was the look of someone who has stopped managing a situation and started engaging with it honestly, and she thought, good. We'll do much better work this way. I have some thoughts, he said carefully. Good, she said. I have some thoughts as well. Between the two of us, I think we can build a working list. Harry looked between them with an expression she recognized, the slightly amazed, slightly amused look of someone watching two people of a similar particular type recognize each other. Are you two going to be working together now? He said. Dumbledore looked at her. She looked at Dumbledore. It seems sensible, she said. It seems entirely sensible, Dumbledore agreed, and she thought she saw, very briefly, something in his eyes that was not performing anything at all, just a very old, very tired man, relieved not to be working alone. She understood that feeling precisely, and she filed it, and she built on it. The year ended with the Mandrakes restoring the petrified and Ginny Weasley cleared of wrongdoing and Lucius Malfoy revealed as the one who had passed the diary to her, which she had suspected since winter and which came into focus when she understood the mechanics of how the diary had arrived in Ginny's second-hand schoolbooks. She did not move against Lucius directly, yet. She filed the information and noted that he had moved against a 12-year-old girl with a dark artifact in order to discredit her father, and she thought, that account will need settling, eventually, and I will settle it on my schedule. On the train home, Ginny sat across from her and looked at her with the expression that had become, over the course of the year, something different from the first-year terror of September. I wanted to say thank you, Ginny said. For all of it. For not thinking you weren't responsible, Lyra said. You were used. Those are very different things. I still feel like, Ginny started. I know, Lyra said. That feeling doesn't resolve immediately. You'll carry it for a while. But it will get smaller. She paused. You are not what was done to you. Remember that. Ginny looked at her, and in her eyes was something that had been building since October, the particular quality of someone who has found a person who tells them the truth, and who has decided to hold on to that. Okay, she said, quietly. Harry, beside Lyra, passed a chocolate frog to Ginny without ceremony, and Ginny caught it and laughed a little, and the train moved south through the summer afternoon, and she leaned back against the seat and let the year settle in her. 2 down. 5 to go. The shape of the war ahead was becoming clearer, and the resources available were growing, and she and Dumbledore were now working toward the same thing with the same information, and she had Harry and she had the people they were building around them, and this, she thought, was what it looked like when you did it right. Not alone. Not afraid. Not weaponized by anyone. Just, moving, with intention, toward the thing you'd decided to build. She closed her eyes and listened to the train, and somewhere below the sound of it she could feel the Thunderbird charge in her wand, and below that the remembered blue of the lightning in the garden, and below that something older still, the fire she had made with her hands in another world, and the self she had always been underneath it. Crown and wand, she thought, which was not something she'd said aloud to anyone. Not yet. Chapter 5, The Wolf and the General. The summer before third year was the summer Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, and she read about it in the Daily Prophet over breakfast at the Dursleys' table while Vernon stared at her with the habitual wariness he'd maintained since year one, and she finished the article twice and put the paper down and thought very carefully. Sirius Black. Mass murderer, according to the Prophet. Supporter of Voldemort. Betrayer of the Potters. The last person to see Peter Pettigrew alive before Pettigrew was reduced to a finger and a crater in a Muggle street. She made herself tea and sat with it and ran the account against what she knew. The problem was the detail of the finger. She had spent 2 years studying magical forensics in the evenings. It was an underappreciated field, she thought, given how much magical crime left evidence that a properly trained observer could read. The detail of the finger bothered her because it was too convenient. Bodies reduced to single body parts by magical explosions didn't work the way the official account described, the force distribution was wrong. And Pettigrew had been an aura-trained wizard, and Sirius Black had supposedly killed 12 muggles and Pettigrew with a single spell, and the geometry of that was not possible. A spell with sufficient force to eliminate 12 people in an enclosed street would not leave one survivor intact enough to lose a finger in a precisely severing way. She had also read everything about the secret keeper system she could find, and the system required voluntary trust. You couldn't be made a secret keeper under duress without the protection failing. Which meant Pettigrew had actively, voluntarily known where the Potters were hiding. She built the model. She turned it over. She looked at the gaps. Pettigrew isn't dead, she thought. Black is innocent. She went upstairs and knocked on Harry's door. He opened it with his hair worse than usual and his glasses on crooked and a look that said he'd been awake for 2 hours reading the same article. "You saw the paper," he said. "Come in," she said, and he stood aside and she sat on the floor with her back against the bed frame in the way she always did when she needed to think out loud, and he dropped cross-legged in front of her. "Tell me your first instinct." "Black is guilty," he said immediately. "That's what everyone says." "Your second instinct." He was quiet for a moment. "Something's wrong with the finger." "Yes," she said. "Walk me through it." He did, and he got most of it without her filling the gaps, which still surprised her sometimes, not because she doubted him, but because he moved so quickly by intuition that it was easy to miss how rigorous the intuition actually was. "So what do we do?" he said, when they'd run it twice. "Nothing yet," she said. "Black is in the wind. Pettigrew, if he's alive, is somewhere we can't currently access. What we can do is go back to Hogwarts and see what the year gives us." She paused. "Lupin is the new defense teacher." Harry looked up. "You know him?" "I know of him," she said. "He was a friend of our parents'. He was at school with Black and Pettigrew and James." She considered what she knew about Remus Lupin, which was less than she'd have liked. He was also not accused of anything after the war. He wasn't imprisoned. He simply disappeared. Why would he do that? "That," she said, "is a very good question." She also had a question she'd been sitting with for 3 weeks that was separate from the Sirius Black situation but connected in the way that most things about their history were connected, their parents. Not the abstract fact of them, but the specific people, what they'd been like, how they'd thought, what choices they'd made and why. She had Dumbledore's account and the official record and Harry's second-hand fragments from people who'd known them, and none of it was enough. Lupin might be. She thought about this with the careful quality of someone who knows they are approaching something that matters and wants to approach it correctly. She had spent 2 lives learning not to want things too much, because wanting had always made her vulnerable to people who knew how to use wants. But she was also, she admitted, 12 years old in a body, and no matter how old her mind was, the body had its needs, and one of them was this: she wanted to know her mother. She set this aside carefully and filed it under when appropriate and went back to the operational picture. Azkaban and the Dementors. The Prophet said the prison was under heightened guard, and Dementors had been deployed on the Hogwarts Express as a precaution, and she had read everything she could find about Dementors in the time since the announcement, and she did not like what she had found. Dementors operated on happiness, specifically on the capacity for positive memory, for hope, for the experience of light experiences. They extracted that. What was left when they were done was the raw residue of the worst things a person had felt or seen, because those were what remained when the good was gone. She had 2 lifetimes of worse things. She was aware that this was not an ideal situation. She had also found, in a 6th-year defense textbook, the theory of the Patronus charm, the specific counter to Dementors, powered by a focused, strongly held positive memory. She had been working on it theoretically for 3 weeks. She had not yet managed the practical, which she attributed to the fact that she was working from theory rather than necessity, and magic of this type tended to require the genuine article rather than the academic version. She was not looking forward to the moment she found out exactly what her worst memories felt like when magnified. The Hogwarts Express left on a rainy September 1st, and the Dementor came through their compartment at dusk. She had been expecting it. She'd chosen a compartment with Lupin. She'd recognized him by the worn quality of his robes and the gray at his temples and the particular exhausted care of someone who had been managing something difficult for a long time, and she'd placed herself nearest the door and kept her wand in her hand under her robes, which was where it lived in situations with elevated risk. When the door opened and the cold came in, she had a fraction of a second of pure, clear preparation, and then the Dementor's effect hit her. The cold was not a temperature. It was an erasure. She felt the positive things she held, Harry's laugh, Hermione's precision, Ron's steady practicality, the castle's hum, the smell of the library, drain away, not violently but with the thoroughness of water running out of a vessel, and what was left was the other thing. Her mother's voice, in the last moment before the green light. Not Lily, Ursa. The day Ursa left. The exact quality of 7-year-old Azula's face when she understood that the person she had loved most in the world had looked at her and found her frightening rather than worth staying for. Then Ozai's face over her in the Agni Kai, calm and assured, pointing fire at his child's face. Then a cell with clean sheets and barred windows and the last thought she'd ever had in her first life, relief, because death was easier than continuing. She pushed. Not with the Patronus. She didn't have the full charm, didn't have it yet, but with the same thing that had always been at the center of her, I am not finished. I am not ending here. I have things to do and I have chosen to do them and nothing in this world or any other gets to take that from me without my permission. It wasn't a happy memory. It was something harder and more load-bearing than happiness. It was will, and it was hers, and she pushed it at the Dementor with her wand and the Thunderbird feather sang and something silver tried to form at the tip, incomplete, flickering, but enough to make the Dementor pull back. Harry had collapsed. She caught him before he hit the floor, which was easier when she moved first and harder when she was already moving, and she had him braced against her shoulder and she looked at Lupin across the compartment, who had produced chocolate and a full Patronus, a silver wolf that filled the compartment with its warm light, and she thought, oh. Of course. Lupin looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read across the compartment and the aftermath. Then he broke the chocolate and distributed it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, and the silver wolf faded, and Harry came back to consciousness with the disoriented look of someone who'd gone somewhere else briefly. Chocolate, she said, handing him a piece. What was that, he said, not quite a question. Dementor, she said. Eat the chocolate. He ate it, and the color came back into his face, and she looked at Lupin, who was watching her with the specific quality of someone who had noticed what she'd done and was deciding what to do with the information. She decided to preempt. The Patronus charm, she said. I've been working on the theory. What I produced wasn't complete. No, he said, carefully. But it was something. For a third year, attempting a Patronus at all is unusual, she said. Yes. Would you teach us properly? He looked at her and then at Harry. Then he said, yes. Come to my office on Thursday. She nodded. She had wanted the offer to come from him rather than from her asking, because she'd learned that offers came with more goodwill attached than requests, but she would have asked directly if the timing had gone differently. The outcome was what mattered. The rest of the journey passed without incident, though she spent it watching Lupin when she thought he wasn't watching her back, which he was, with the careful attention of someone trying to fit a thing into a category it didn't quite belong in. She let him watch. She was watching him too. Lupin's first defense class was better than anything Hogwarts had offered them so far, and she knew good teaching when she encountered it, not the performance of teaching, not the repetition of information, but the actual transmission of understanding, the kind that changed how you thought rather than just what you knew. The Boggart was an inspired choice. Practical, immediate, requiring genuine engagement with something personal and genuine in front of the class, it got around the problem that most practical exercises had, which was that you could perform competently without actually engaging. You couldn't perform ridiculous without engaging the fear. She watched her classmates go through it with the observer's eye. She applied to everything, cataloging what people feared and how they faced it, what that told her about how they worked. She noticed Neville's Snape Boggart with appreciation. Neville's fears were social rather than physical, which was a specific kind of fear that took different courage to face. She noticed Ron's Spider with affectionate recognition. She noticed Hermione's McGonagall with mild surprise that resolved immediately into, of course, she's afraid of failure, and failure is measured by authority's assessment. When it was her turn, she walked forward and felt the Boggart shift toward her, and she thought, let's see which one it picks. The Boggart considered her for a moment, and she felt it, the brief hesitation of something that reads its target and finds the reading complicated, and then it resolved. It became her. An older version, not the first life's Azula, not her current self, but a version between them, cold-eyed, alone, sitting in the precise center of the power she'd always known she could build. A queen with nothing left to want. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, ridiculous, and thought, put Harry beside her. The Boggart Lyra laughed, which was slightly disturbing but was categorically different from the thing she'd feared, and she walked back to her place in line. Lupin was watching her with the expression that was becoming familiar to her on him, the one that was trying to sort her into something it understood. After class, when the others had filed out, she stayed. Harry stayed with her, which she'd expected. Lupin looked at them both. How are you finding Hogwarts this year? Good, Harry said. The new defense teacher is a significant improvement on the last one. Lupin's expression did the complicated thing it did when he was both amused and saddened by something. Your father said the same thing about teachers he liked, he said, carefully. He had a particular way of delivering a compliment that was also completely accurate. Harry went very still. She stayed still in a different way, already still, now more deliberate. You knew him well, she said. Very well, Lupin said. He looked between them. James and I were close friends. For many years. And Sirius Black, she said. Another pause, longer. Then, yes. Sirius too. And Peter Pettigrew, she said. The silence this time had a different quality, careful, loaded, the quality of someone walking through something they've been carrying for a long time and are very aware of where they're stepping. Yes, he said. She looked at him steadily. She had been building to this question since August, and she asked it now cleanly, without preamble. Do you believe Black is guilty? Lupin looked at her. His face went through something that was too fast and too complicated to fully read, and she caught pieces of it, pain, and guilt, and the particular anguish of someone who has a belief they're afraid to have. That is, he said finally, a complicated question. I know, she said. I'm asking it anyway. He was quiet for a long moment, and she waited, because she had found that Lupin was someone who needed the silence, not stalling, but genuinely working through what he wanted to give, and rushing him would get less than waiting. I don't know, he said at last. And that is the most honest answer I can give you. It's enough, she said. For now. She met his eyes, and he met hers, and she thought, he knows something he hasn't decided whether to tell us. He's protecting someone or protecting himself from the possibility that what he thinks might be true. She also thought, he is exactly what I expected and considerably better than I hoped, and he is going to tell us, eventually. Thursday, she said. For the Patronus lessons. He nodded. Thursday. They left, and Harry fell into step beside her in the corridor, and he said, he knows something. He does, she said. About Black? About the whole of it, she said. He was there, he was in the middle of it, however it actually happened. He knows what he saw and he knows what he didn't see, and he's been sitting with the gap between those two things for 12 years. She paused. He'll tell us when he's ready. Or when the situation makes waiting impossible. You think Black is innocent, Harry said. I think the account is wrong, she said. Whether Black is innocent depends on things I don't have yet. He thought about this. If he's innocent, Then Pettigrew is alive, she said. And somewhere accessible. And the Potter's secret keeper situation is more complicated than the official story. She paused. And someone let an innocent man go to Azkaban knowing he was innocent. The corridor was cold and the torches guttered in a draft from somewhere, and they walked in silence with this between them, and she thought about what 12 years in Azkaban felt like to a person and made a very quiet, very certain decision: if he's innocent, I will get him out. Not for justice in the abstract, which was a concept she respected but had never prioritized over practical outcomes. Because he was the last of their parents' world. Because if the official story was wrong, then there was something still living from that night that hadn't been accounted for, and she needed to account for it. Because she had felt, in the abstract, in the bones of this body, what it was to be locked in a room that wasn't yours. And because he'd been James Potter's best friend, and she didn't have many ways left to know her father. The Patronus lessons were Thursday evenings in Lupin's office, which smelled like old books and something herbal she identified as wolfsbane potion by the third week, which was information she filed without comment. She had suspected, actually. Since the Express. Not from the tiredness alone, lots of people were tired, but from the specific quality of it, the cyclical nature, the dates on which he was absent from meals. She'd mapped those dates against the lunar calendar in early October and confirmed what she thought. She did not bring it up. It was his to tell or not tell, and it was not relevant to their current work, and she had found that people were more willing to be honest about difficult things when they weren't cornered about them. The Patronus lesson was the hardest magical work she had done. The charm required a specific kind of memory, not just positive, but genuine, something the magical intent could anchor to. She had many memories. She had 2 lifetimes of them. But the memories that were strong enough to anchor a Patronus were also the memories that had been most tested, most damaged, most complicated by the things that had happened after them, and disentangling the pure version from the layered version was difficult. She stood in Lupin's office and pointed her wand and thought, Harry in the garden, 8 years old, the snail rising 4 inches. Silver mist. Weak. She pushed harder. The castle humming hello at the beginning of 2nd year, like a familiar voice. Brighter. Not enough. She thought, Hermione's face when I told her she was essential. Ron in the chess game, giving everything without hesitation. Neville telling me he wanted to be brave. Brighter still. She thought, Harry beside me in the boat on the lake at night, the castle coming toward us, and him saying ready. The light that came from her wand was not mist. It was something forming, she could feel the shape of it before she could see it, something that moved with an energy she recognized deep in her chest, something fast and very bright. A bird. Enormous. On fire, but not fire, something that was light and heat and speed combined, the suggestion of wings that were partly wings and partly something more like lightning mid-crack. It screamed, and the sound was nothing like a bird and everything like atmosphere and power, and it filled the office with gold-white light, and Lupin took a step back. It held for 6 seconds, and then she let it go, and it dissolved. She stood in the aftermath and breathed. Lupin looked at the space where it had been. Then he looked at her with the full weight of his attention, undivided. What is that? He said, and his voice was very quiet. I'm not certain, she said honestly. A thunderbird, I think. Or something like one. Miss Potter, he said, and then stopped, and she thought she saw him make a decision. Lyra. How long have you been practicing magic? Since I was 5, she said. Seriously. Though the formal theory is more recent. He sat down. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was the one he wore when he was about to say something he'd been carrying. Your mother, he said, was the best student I saw at Hogwarts in my 7 years here. Not the most naturally talented, though she was very talented. The most committed. The most, he searched for it, serious, in the specific sense of treating magic as something worth being serious about. She held very still. Your father was different, he said. James was, he was natural, effortless, with the gift of someone who had never had to work hard for anything and was still exceptional. That was James. He paused. And Sirius was, another pause, longer. Sirius was the most capable person I have ever known, in terms of raw magical ability. Terrifying, honestly, in the very best sense. He could do things. He stopped. She waited. None of them were quite like you, he said. And you are 12. I'm aware, she said. Where does it come from? She looked at him steadily. I don't know, she said, which was true in the sense that she couldn't tell him what it came from and also somewhat untrue in the sense that she knew perfectly well. He studied her. She thought he was close to pushing further, and she thought he might push in a direction she wasn't ready to go yet, and then Harry produced a truly spectacular Patronus in the corner of the room, a stag, enormous and bright, and both of them turned to look at it, and the moment passed. Harry was staring at his own Patronus with the expression of someone who has done something they didn't quite expect and is working out what it means to them. The stag was bright and solid and moved with the particular certainty of something that belonged where it was, and it turned and looked at Harry directly, and Harry looked back, and something passed between them. Lupin's face went very quiet. She looked at him, and she knew what he was seeing, the stag, and what the stag meant, and the boy who had produced it, and she thought, this is why he came back. He needed this. Not the job. Not the salary. The stag. James's animagus form, she said quietly, to Lupin, not to Harry. Yes, he said, barely above a murmur. And blacks, she asked, while Harry was still absorbed in the stag. Lupin looked at her sharply. A dog, he said, after a moment. A large black dog. She filed this. Then she said, very quietly, the Grim. His expression answered the question she hadn't asked. November brought Quidditch in the rain and the Dementors on the pitch and Harry falling from his broom, and she was in the stands and she had her wand out before he'd fallen 20 feet and she cast the best arresto momentum she had and it slowed him enough that when he hit the pitch it was survivable, if barely. She was down from the stands and running while he was still bouncing, and she was the first person to reach him, and she crouched over him in the rain with her hand on his face and said, Harry. He opened his eyes. Broom, he said, which was not what she'd expected. Later, she said. First, are you concussed? Probably, he agreed. She looked up. Lupin was coming across the pitch with the expression of someone doing several things at once, and Dumbledore was descending from the stands, and the Dementors were being driven back by 3 patron users at once, Lupin's wolf, and 2 from the faculty she didn't take the time to identify. Harry grabbed her arm. The broom, he said again. She looked toward the forbidden forest where the broom had gone when the Whomping Willow caught it, and she thought, ah. It's gone, she said. I know, he said. That's okay. She looked at him with the look that meant she knew he was lying. It's fine, he said. We'll get you another one, she said. It was Dad's, he said, quietly, and she thought, oh. The nimbus had been James's, she hadn't known that, hadn't had that piece of it, and she held the weight of it carefully and didn't push. She put her hand briefly on top of his, and he exhaled, and the rain came down, and Madame Pomfrey materialized with a briskness that left no room for sentiment and they were both guided toward the castle. She found the Marauders map on a Tuesday in December. Not by accident, nothing she found was by accident anymore. She had been looking for it since October, because she had read a reference to a magical map of Hogwarts in an article about the school's history that mentioned its creation by 4 students in the 1970s, and she had done the math on who 4 students in the 1970s who were good enough to create something like that would have been, and she'd known what she was looking for. It was confiscated material. She found it in Filch's cabinet not by breaking in but by the simpler method of engaging Filch in a conversation about the history of school disciplinary systems, which he found extraordinarily satisfying to talk about, while her hand, out of his sightline, moved through the open cabinet drawer with the patient efficiency of someone who had been operating in rooms that required subtlety since childhood. She read the map in her room. The four names on the front made her sit very still for a moment: Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, Prongs. Mooney was Lupin. The moon, werewolf, she'd already confirmed this. Padfoot was Black. The dog. Prongs was James. The stag. And Wormtail was Pettigrew. She looked at the map for a very long time. Then she looked at the fourth name. Wormtail. A rat's tail. Pettigrew, who had been a rat animagus. Who had been killed in the street. Who had been reduced to a finger. She opened the map fully and watched the dots of people moving through the castle, every person, named, and she looked for a name she wasn't expecting to find, in a dormitory she knew, next to the small red dot labeled Ronald Weasley. There was a dot labeled Peter Pettigrew. In Gryffindor Tower. In Ron's dormitory. She looked at this dot for a very long time. Then she got up and went to find Ron. She didn't tell him what she knew, not yet. She told him she needed to see Scabbers, which she knew would be fine because Scabbers had been in the Weasley family for 12 years and everyone treated the rat as furniture. Ron produced him from his pocket with the casual affection of someone who'd had a pet for so long they'd forgotten to assess it, and she held the rat in her hands and felt it tremble. She looked at it. It looked at her. Its eyes were small and very bright and they had the quality she'd come to recognize in people who were trying very hard not to show that they were afraid. "Hello," she said quietly, to the rat. The rat made a sound that was not quite a rat sound. "I know what you are," she said. "Not yet, I'm not going to do anything yet. But I know. And you should know that I know." She paused. "And you should know that if you run, I will find you, and if you hurt my brother or Ron or anyone in this school in any way, the outcome will be much less comfortable than what's currently planned." She stroked it once between the ears, very gently. "We understand each other." The rat shivered. She gave it back to Ron, who had been watching with the look he got when she did something that was completely opaque to him, and she said, "Thank you." "What was that?" Ron said. "Research," she said. She went straight to Harry. She told him everything, the map, the names, the dot, the rat. She watched his face change as he put it together, and the change was something she'd never quite described to anyone because it was too specific and too important, the way his face went from surprise to fury to a cold, focused clarity that she recognized as a quality she'd been watching develop in him all year. "Pettigrew is alive," he said. "He's in this building," she said. "He's been in this building every year we've been here." Harry looked at her with the expression of someone making a decision. "And Sirius is innocent," she said. "And somewhere in the grounds. I've been tracking the Grim sightings, there have been 3, all near the Forbidden Forest boundary. He's been watching." Harry stood up and went to his window, which looked out over the grounds, and she let him have the moment. He was quiet for long enough that she started cataloging what he'd be working through: 12 years of an innocent man in Azkaban, the man who should have been his godfather, the friend of the father he'd never known. When he turned back his face was resolved. "We're getting him out. We're getting him out," she confirmed. "But we need Pettigrew first. We need Pettigrew alive and talking, because without him there's no case, Sirius was never tried, there's no legal structure to overturn, which means what we need is evidence sufficient to force a trial, and Pettigrew alive and talking is that evidence. How do we get him to talk?" "We don't," she said. "We just make it very difficult for him to run." The plan she built over the next 2 weeks was, she thought, one of the cleaner ones she'd assembled, clean in the sense of having few moving parts, each part doing exactly its job. She needed 3 things to align: Sirius, Pettigrew, and a moment in which she controlled the environment. The shrieking shack came from Lupin. She had been watching him and the map, and she had noticed that on full moon nights, Lupin's dot moved toward the Whomping Willow and disappeared, the same vanishing that she suspected corresponded to the tunnel Sirius had once used. She had traced the tunnel's endpoint from the castle's architectural memory to the shrieking shack, and she had a working theory about the shack's screaming history that did not involve ghosts. She also had, after considerable thought, decided to tell Lupin what she knew. Not everything, not Pettigrew's location, not yet, because she wasn't certain Lupin's response could be controlled. But enough. She went to his office on a Tuesday evening with Harry and she said, "I know about the animagi." The silence was the weight of 12 years. "All 4 of them," she said. "I have the map. I know what the names mean. I know Padfoot is black and Wormtail is Pettigrew and Prongs is." She stopped, because she could see Lupin's face and she knew when to stop. He was very still in the way of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just had it named by someone else. "How?" he said. "The map," she said. "And the castle. And 12 years of a story with too many wrong details." She paused. "He's innocent. Isn't he?" The silence this time stretched and she waited, and she watched Remus Lupin decide whether to trust her, and she held herself still and let him decide. "I don't know," he said, which was the same answer he'd given the first time, but it sounded different. This time it sounded like, "I think he is and I've been afraid to think that for 12 years. "Then help me find out," she said. "Because Pettigrew is alive and in this building and I need your help to contain him when I bring him out." Lupin's eyes were very sharp. "What did you say?" "Pettigrew is alive," she said. "He faked his death. He's been in this school as Ron Weasley's rat for 3 years." Lupin looked at her and then he looked at Harry and then he looked at her again and she thought she saw 12 years of grief and guilt and uncertain fury running through him in something under a second. "You're certain," he said. "The map names every person in the building," she said. "There is a dot labeled Peter Pettigrew in Gryffindor Tower." He stood up very suddenly and then sat back down with the controlled motion of someone managing a physical response. She watched him carefully. "When?" he said. "Soon," she said. "The end of term. I want it done before Christmas, because after Christmas Sirius's position becomes harder, the ministry will tighten the search in January." She paused. "I need you to help me contain Pettigrew if he tries to transform. And I need you to be somewhere I can reach if things go wrong." "I should go to Dumbledore," he said. "You should," she agreed. "And you will. After. Because if you go before, Pettigrew runs, and we lose him, and Sirius stays in Azkaban forever." She paused. "Can you trust me on the sequence?" He looked at her for a very long time. She held it steadily. "Yes," he said. "God help me." "Good," she said. "Now. Tell me about Sirius Black. The person, not the case." He looked at her, and she thought she was going to have to work harder for it, and then he simply said, "He was the most loyal person I've ever known." That's the part that never made sense to me. Even when I told myself the evidence was clear, the loyalty never made sense. "No," she said. "It wouldn't. Because the evidence was wrong." She paused. "Tell me more." He talked for an hour. She listened to every word. The night she chose was a Thursday, 3 days before the Christmas holidays, with a sky that was clear enough that she could feel the weather, no rain, which mattered for what she had in mind, and a full moon that was 2 weeks out, which mattered for a different reason. She took Harry and Hermione and told Ron what she needed from him, which was his rat and his trust, in that order. Ron looked at her for a moment with the careful expression he wore when he was doing the chess player thing, running positions forward. "Scabbers is Pettigrew," he said. She hadn't told him yet. She looked at him. "I figured it out," he said. "Last week. I didn't want to say anything until," he paused. "I've had him for 12 years. And he stopped again. "He used your family as cover," she said. "Deliberately. That account needs settling." "Yeah," Ron said, with a quality she recognized as controlled fury, the kind that was more dangerous than the explosive version. "Yeah, okay. What do you need?" The Shrieking Shack was accessed through the Whomping Willow, and she had read enough about the tree to know the knot that froze it. She'd found the reference in a manuscript from 1978, the same year the Whomping Willow had been planted, which was the same year Lupin had been a student, which was not a coincidence. She froze the tree with a precisely aimed immobulus, and they went through the tunnel fast and low and came up into the shack, which smelled like very old dust and something that was not quite animal and not quite human. Sirius Black was in the upper room. He looked like the picture in The Prophet and nothing like it. The Prophet's picture was a man who had been reduced to something basic and frightened, and the man in the room was, she could see what he had been, before. Tall, gray-eyed, with the remnants of a face that had once been remarkable and still was, in a damaged way, and he looked at Harry like someone who has been given back something they'd lost and doesn't quite believe it yet. Then he saw her. His expression when he looked at her was the same as Lupin's had been, the same as most people's when they encountered the two of them together, the blink, the recalibration, the not quite prepared for two, but different from most people's in one specific way. His eyes moved to her scar and then away, and he said nothing at all, which was unusual and notable. Sirius Black, she said. Lyra Potter, he said, which was the first time he'd said her name, and the way he said it was someone who'd been carrying the name for a long time. We don't have a great deal of time, she said. Pettigrew is here. He's coming. Black's expression changed. The complicated grief and hope of seeing Harry collapsed into something harder and more focused. How did you, later, she said. Positions. If he transforms, I need you on the right side of the room. Lupin is in the tunnel, he'll come if I call. You brought Lupin, he said, and something in his voice loosened fractionally. Yes. Harry, with me. Ron, keep hold of the rat, don't let go regardless of what happens, and if he bites you, hold on anyway. Wonderful, Ron muttered, holding Scabbers with the careful grip of someone who has revised their relationship with what they're holding. Hermione, she said. Blocking the door, Hermione said, already in position, wand out, with the focused calm of someone who had been frightened and had decided the fright was less important than what she needed to do. She looked at Scabbers. She looked at Ron's hands. She said, very calmly, Peter. The rat went rigid. We can do this the straightforward way, she said. You transform, we talk, you tell Sirius's story the way it actually happened, and you live. Or you try to run, and I light every exit and we do it the complicated way. She paused. Your choice. You have about 3 seconds. Scabbers became Pettigrew with a sound like reality briefly disagreeing with itself. He was small. That was the first thing, small and gray and wet-eyed and already talking, the words coming in a rush before his human voice had fully solidified. Wasn't my fault, Sirius, you have to understand, they would have killed me, I had no choice. Stop, she said. He stopped. She looked at Peter Pettigrew. She looked at the man who had sold her parents' location for his own safety, who had been a rat in her dormitory's neighboring room for 3 years, who had let an innocent man go to Azkaban while he lived in the warm and was fed and was safe. She looked at him and she felt something she recognized from her first life, the thing she'd spent 2 lifetimes managing, the cold part of herself that knew exactly what someone deserved and was very willing to provide it. She breathed. Not like that, she thought. Not this time. Here's what you're going to do, she said. You're going to tell us exactly what happened the night the Potters were killed. All of it. You're going to tell us who you went to afterward and why. And you're going to come with us when we leave here and you're going to say every word of it to Dumbledore. She paused. If you do that, you live. If you run, I will find you, and the offer expires. Pettigrew looked at her, and at Sirius, and at Harry, and his eyes moved in the calculating way of someone trying to find the escape route, and she watched him not find one. They'll send me to Azkaban, he said. Yes, she agreed. Then why would I? Because the alternative, she said, very quietly, is considerably less comfortable than Azkaban, and you know that, looking at Sirius Black's face right now, you know that. She paused. And because it's right. I know that's not a currency you're accustomed to, but I'm offering it to you anyway. The silence went on long enough that she thought she might have to do something else, and then Pettigrew's shoulders dropped and he said, "Fine." It went, mostly, correctly. Pettigrew talked. Sirius and Harry listened, and she catalogued, and Hermione kept the exit, and Ron sat against the wall with his arms around his knees and the expression of someone processing a significant revision to their understanding of something they'd trusted. When Pettigrew finished, she said, "Lupin." Lupin came through the tunnel door, and the look that passed between him and Sirius Black lasted approximately forever and was not something she described in the account she gave Dumbledore later because it was not hers to describe. They took Pettigrew back to the castle, herself and Lupin flanking him, Sirius walking with Harry, Ron and Hermione keeping pace, and she held the situation together with the particular quality of attention that was less conscious management and more the simple fact that nothing was going wrong on her watch. Then the moon came out. She had checked the lunar calendar twice. She had been certain. She looked up at the moon and thought, there was cloud cover. I calculated for cloud cover. There was supposed to be cloud cover. Lupin made a sound that was not a sound a person made. She moved immediately. "Pettigrew," she said, and grabbed for him, but he was already transforming. She could feel the magic of it, the shape shift, the particular energy of an animagus transformation, and then he was a rat and then he was gone, into the dark, and she stood in the moonlit grounds with Lupin mid-transformation and made the fastest decision she'd made in 2 lives. She stepped between Lupin and Harry. Lupin becoming wolf was enormous and the intelligence behind his eyes was gone, replaced by the absolute animal clarity of something that moved on instinct and hunger, and she raised her wand and thought of Harry on his first broom, and the Patronus came. The Thunderbird that came out of her wand was the full version. She'd had it 4 times now, each time more solid, and this time it was absolutely real, enormous and bright and crackling at its wing edges with the atmospheric charge that was hers and had always been hers. It spread over her and Harry and Ron and Hermione like an umbrella of golden light and screamed, the sound she'd learned to identify as backup in Thunderbird rather than language, and the wolf Lupin flinched, circled, couldn't enter the light and eventually turned and went into the forbidden forest. She held the Patronus until the sounds were gone. Then she let it go and turned around. Harry was watching her with the look that meant something had just become real to him that had previously been theoretical. "The lightning on the wings," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's you," he said. "That's not just a Patronus. That's actually yours." "Yes," she said again. He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been holding that back." "I've been learning it," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Harry," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. He gestured, vaguely, at the space where the Thunderbird had been. "You're extraordinary and you always have been and sometimes it's still surprising." She looked at him, and she thought, this is why I chose differently, and she said, "So are you." "A stag, Harry." He looked at his own hands. Then he smiled, the full one, and she looked away first, which was unusual for her, because something in her chest was doing something she still didn't entirely have language for but was learning to let be. They didn't get Pettigrew back. That was the failure, and she acknowledged it cleanly. She had underestimated the moon timeline and Pettigrew had used the chaos to run, and the consequence of that was that the evidence was gone. Sirius was captured. Briefly. She found out at dawn, from Dumbledore's drawn face, and she thought for approximately 2 seconds and then she said, "The time turner." Dumbledore looked at her. "Hermione has a time turner for classes," she said. "She's been using it since September." "If we go back 3 hours, this is very dangerous," Dumbledore said. "I know," she said. "Tell me the restrictions." He told her. She listened and built the plan in the time it took him to speak and said, "We can do it." "Where is Sirius being held?" "The tower," Dumbledore said. "He'll be given the kiss at sundown unless, then we have 6 hours," she said. "That's more than enough." She told Harry exactly what they needed to do and not one word more, because the time loop required precise action and no improvisation, and Harry listened with the focus that appeared when things were real and said, "Where do we get Buckbeak?" "He's still in Hagrid's paddock," she said. "We have 30 seconds to move him, starting." She looked at the time turner in Hermione's hand. "Now." The 3 hours they traveled back through were 3 of the most operationally complex hours she'd experienced in either life, managing herself and Harry through the presence of their past selves, keeping Buckbeak calm and moving, timing the rescue to the second. She didn't panic once, and Harry didn't panic once, and they moved through the backwards time with the particular focused precision of 2 people who had been practicing exactly this kind of thinking all year. Sirius on the back of Buckbeak, rising into the summer side of the night sky, she watched it from the tower window and felt something she had not expected, something warm and complete that was not triumph exactly but was related to it. The feeling of a system working. Of something broken being given back. "He's gone," Harry said, beside her, watching the retreating shape of the hippogriff. "He's free," she said. Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then, we'll find Pettigrew." "We will," she said. "And when we do, Sirius gets his life back properly." She paused. "With a trial. With the full record. I'm going to make sure of it." He turned to look at her. "How?" "One thing at a time," she said. "But I'm going to make sure of it." He held her gaze, and in his eyes was the trust that she had been building toward for 3 years, not the blind kind, not the naive kind, but the kind that knew exactly what it was trusting and had chosen to trust it with clear eyes, and she held it carefully, the way she held all the things worth holding. Dumbledore was waiting for them when the 3 hours resolved. He looked at them both and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Well done." "We didn't get Pettigrew," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you did something else." He paused. "You know, I have lived a very long time, and I have been wrong about a great many things. I was wrong about how to handle Sirius Black 12 years ago, and I was wrong about how much you two should be protected rather than included this year." He looked at her specifically. "You are not someone who benefits from protection, Miss Potter. You benefit from information and trust." "Yes," she said. "I am aware." "I'll try to remember it," he said. "I'll remind you if you forget," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I have no doubt," he said. The year ended and Lupin resigned. His condition had been made public, as she'd suspected someone would eventually arrange, and she filed Severus Snape under that account also needs settling with the particular cold clarity she reserved for things she intended to address at the correct moment. On the train home, she sat with the 3 of them in the particular feeling of a year that had been harder than the last one and more productive in ways she was still mapping. She had Sirius, not with her, not legally free, but alive and out and connected. She had a better understanding of the Horcrux problem. She had the map, which she kept and intended to keep. She had the Thunderbird, solid now, hers in a way she could rely on. She had Harry, who had produced a stag from a memory of their parents and called it effortlessly and then not mentioned it again because he was Harry and that was how he worked. She had Ron and Hermione and Ginny and Neville and more than she'd started with in any year she could remember. "Next year," Ron said, across from her, eating something from a paper bag the twins had given him. "What do you think next year is going to be like?" "Different," Harry said. "Busy," Hermione said. She looked out the window at the countryside going past, green and summer gold and wide, and thought about the Horcruxes and Voldemort's timeline and the political landscape of the wizarding world and Sirius and Pettigrew still at large and the things she was building and the things that were coming. "Interesting," she said. Ron looked at her expression and said, "That's ominous." "It's accurate," she said. "Same thing with you," he said, but he was smiling, and she looked at all 3 of them, Ron and Hermione and Harry, in the train's warm afternoon light, completely themselves, and she thought, yes. This is what I chose. This is exactly what I chose. She turned back to the window and watched England unfold itself toward summer, and somewhere in her chest the Thunderbird charge settled warm and constant, and she planned.